My mom and dad were married in Michigan and divorced when I was 2. So I really don't know my parents to have had a relationship together, but they were really good co-parents. And then when I turned probably around 12 or 13 years old, my mom graduated from X-ray school and we moved to Texas for work. I found myself being very alone in the beginning, especially through middle school. But we made it, and I don't think you could pay me to go back now. I graduated high school in '99, and I wanted to be a police officer. I'm not quite sure what motivated me to go down that route. I've always been kind of a square, never been a rule pusher or breaker. So it was just kind of a fit for me.
In 2002, 21-year-old Amanda Siggers is in her second year studying criminal justice at San Jacinto College in Houston, Texas.
I was a young girl that had the world at my fingertips, really. I was having a decent time with my friends, exploring the city and just living life. One day, a friend and I were preparing for a test, and we chose to go to a local bookstore, coffee shop, and study. We happened to look over, and there was this guy sitting at an adjacent table. He was very handsome. After a while, conversation ensued with him.
25-year-old Cy Ghosh tells Amanda and her friend that he works as a pharmaceutical sales rep, but intends to go back to school.
Cy had told me that he graduated from UT with a pre-med degree. He applied to get into Baylor College of Medicine, and he was accepted, but he denied the acceptance and ended up venturing into something else. He eventually got both of our phone numbers, and I thought for sure he was going to call her, but he ended up calling me, and I was ecstatic. The beginning of our relationship was very fun. So I was very much a gentleman from the word go, and he really just laid out the red carpet.
He was very, very polite, very cordial, pretty much like Amanda had told me. He was a tall, handsome man, and I knew that she was, she was very smitten.
Culturally, he was very different from me. I found him to be very interesting. Even though he was raised here in the United States, he had a lot of Eastern values. His parents were first-generation Indians. I got to learn a lot about the temples and just the peaceful nature of Hinduism. It's such a beautiful culture. He told me that his father and mother were divorced, and prior to us getting together, he had moved out of his father's home and into his mother's home. He was very uncomfortable at his mother's house. She would consistently be on him, nagging him about something, mostly his career, because in that culture, career and education is number one. They generally live in the home for quite some time, even after college, in an effort to save as much money as possible. And so he was, staying in the house even at an older age because that's culturally just what was of the norm for them. Cy's mother's name is Lipika. She was very much about money, prestige. She didn't care for the union between Cy and I. He relayed that message to me, and I feel like she wanted him to marry an Indian woman and not a white woman. But we chose to look past it. 3 months later, she realized that he was serious about me because he actually brought me home, and we ended up staying the night there. And she opened up the door, and I was there. She shut the door very fast, and Cy had to go put that fire out. She was very vocal about me being a white bitch, and she didn't want that white bitch staying the night in her house. It was certainly a shock, but I knew that he wasn't going to listen to that. I knew how he felt about me, but it was very hurtful. We ended up leaving, and I don't believe I ever stayed the night there again.
Cy's dad, on the other hand, welcomes Amanda with open arms.
Cy's father, his name is Biz. I did not feel like he was racially against me or us being together. I felt like he genuinely wanted to see us succeed in life. He was just a very kind soul.
In late 2002, Biz asks his son and Amanda to come live with him and his current wife, Kay. He has been diagnosed with terminal cancer and wants to spend his last days with his son.
The first few weeks were good. Kay was on board with everything. She knew that we were there to help and not to hinder. But then it started to decline. I could tell that there was tension between Kay and Cy. Cy went on to tell me that Kay would say false things about him. Eventually, it felt like I was walking on eggshells everywhere I went. One evening, Kay cornered me. She said, "You have no idea the person that you're getting involved with. You have no idea who he is. And I would highly encourage you to stay away." At the time, I thought, whatever, I'm in love and he's so good to me and he has nothing good to say about her, so it tainted my ability to really take her seriously.
Despite the tension, all three focus on caring for Biz. Until his death in July of 2003, Cy is inconsolable.
He was devastated. Biz was a primary force in his life. And once he passed, I think that Cy felt empty. I think he felt scared. Very different, mentally very different.
Things come to a head when Amanda finds something suspicious in Cy's car.
I found a box of condoms, and it prompted a lot of questions. He became defensive, and it led to a horrific argument, and I started to get a little bit scared. And I had attempted to make a phone call, and he ripped the phone out of the wall. So I made my way to the front door, and I pushed the panic button on the alarm, which immediately sends a call to 911. So I knew that they were on the way, and he knew they were on the way as well, and he left. So the police showed up, and I let them know what had transpired. I did not press charges. It was hours later that he came back, and I vividly remember just being so upset that he was gone, not knowing what was going to transpire, if we were breaking up.
Cy begs Amanda's forgiveness, and Amanda rationalizes that he is deeply grieving and not acting like himself.
I forgave him, and we just chose to ultimately put it behind us. I had a lot of big hopes for our relationship, and I wanted things to be normal again. So I just made it okay. And we were fine. We were fine after that.
In 2005, Amanda and Cy decide to take the next big step.
I was very happy for my daughter to get married. She was very happy about getting married.
And by this time, Cy's mom has accepted Amanda into her son's life.
So we had a Hindu ceremony at the Meenakshi temple, and 2 days later we had the Christian ceremony. My family came to the Hindu ceremony. I had to wear a red sari, red and gold. It was absolutely beautiful.
The highlight was when I saw them walking towards the limousine to spend the rest of their lives together. That's the way it was supposed to work.
I felt like my dreams were coming true. We were in forward motion.
Cy applies to medical school, and life seems on track. Until he does an about-face and pressures Amanda to change her career.
It came out of left field for sure. He was very adamant that being a police officer, that was a blue-collar job. It wasn't acceptable to him or his family, and he made it very clear that it was not where he saw his life going.
Instead, he wants her to go into healthcare as well.
I was to go through nursing school, and we were going to open and run a practice together. In theory, it was the fairy tale. I caved in because I felt like he knew better than I did. He was 5 years older than me, and he had a plan.
Cy chooses a podiatry school in Des Moines, Iowa, and Amanda gets accepted into a nearby nursing school.
When they moved to Iowa, they were about 10 hours closer to Michigan, I think, so I could see them more often. I would take the train over. help her decorate. And I love doing it. As a father, it was great for me to be able to do that.
But Amanda doesn't adapt well to her new field of study.
Well, I was in a clinical setting one day, and I ended up passing out. And that's when my professor pulled me to the side and said, you know, you may want to rethink your career choice.
She said, Dad, I really want to do it. But she knew that she couldn't do it because she couldn't stay on the sight of blood, so.
Amanda decides to withdraw from the program.
When I told Cy, he didn't react well. He made it very clear that he was embarrassed by my decision. He told me he was very disappointed and that I needed to do it. I stood my ground, that I wanted to do something else. And ultimately, he had called me white trash and bitch and wished that I was dead. That's when I realized that I had made a mistake.
When Amanda Ghosh quits nursing school, her husband Cy becomes verbally abusive.
But I'm a loyal soul. I'm very loyal to my mate. And I chose to stay. I didn't think that there wasn't anything that we couldn't fix. I took my vows, my marriage vows, very seriously.
Amanda forges ahead despite Cy's disapproval.
I took all of my criminal justice and nursing courses and wrapped it into a general studies degree, basically the highest level associate degree you can get from a junior college, and I moved on. But I didn't feel proud of that accomplishment, actually. Cy belittled me because it wasn't good enough, and so I felt like a failure.
And I felt that there was things going on that I didn't know about, which relayed into their marriage some friction.
He definitely made me feel devalued. I felt alone. I felt isolated. I missed my family.
And then, a call from out of the blue brings family directly into Amanda's life in an unexpected way.
Amber was my half-sister. She was born to my dad and my stepmom, Joyce. She was 4 years younger than me, almost to the day. The only sister I've ever had. And as she got older, she became dependent on drugs. We went our separate ways.
While struggling with addiction, 21-year-old Amber gives birth to a baby girl, Kelsey. When Kelsey is a few months old, Amber is ordered by a Michigan judge to enter rehab for 90 days.
The paternity had not been established on Kelsey. And I received a phone call from CPS asking me if I would be interested in doing a temporary foster placement for my niece. It was a no-brainer for me, but I wanted to make sure it was okay with Cy to bring her into the home, and he agreed.
In January of 2007, Amanda travels to Michigan to get her niece.
When I first saw Kelsey, she was only 11 pounds at 7 months old. I knew instantly that I was never going to give her back.
Amber was not capable of taking care of a child, but Amanda was, so I was happy that Kelsey was in a safe place.
I knew that I was on the path that God had laid out for me. She was a sickly baby due to being born addicted. She cried incessantly. It is very hard to deal with a baby that never stops crying. But somehow you figure out how to deal with it.
Amber didn't finish her rehabilitation, so the court awarded Amanda to keep taking care of Kelsey.
Even though he never said it, I think Cy felt like he had made a mistake. I think he quickly realized that the responsibility of a child was far more than he anticipated. Unfortunately, it wore Cy down over time. I was doing the laundry one day and the baby was crying. I walked around the corner and he was shaking her violently. I was shocked. I couldn't believe that he was doing what he was doing to such a tiny, fragile little baby. I was just blown away. And it was in that moment that I knew I had to leave. He has absolutely crossed the line. I need to get her out of there. He didn't deserve the title of being a dad.
In May 2007, Amanda moves back to Houston with Kelsey, leaving Cy behind in Iowa.
I was going to take care of this baby. That was my mission. Why the career choices that I had made and why it didn't pan out. I knew that I was supposed to be Kelsey's mom. I was able to find a townhouse apartment right next door to my mom, which was extremely helpful because she was able to help me with the baby. I got a part-time job so that we could survive. Somehow we made it work. All of a sudden I became a single mom. We were divorced in December of 2008. He filed for divorce and it was uncontested. It was easy, 2-page divorce. I felt like it was the worst thing that had ever happened to me, but probably the best thing that could have ever happened to me at the same time. It was such a weird feeling.
Amanda enrolls in a sonography program for training in ultrasound.
I felt very confident. I found my independence. I was going to school and I was working full-time. Kelsey was going to daycare and thriving in daycare. We were happy. I was free of all of the dysfunction that I had lived in for so long.
But Amanda's newfound peace will not last for long.
So I moved back to Texas in December of 2009, early 2010. And that's when the stalking began.
I can't imagine what that would feel like to be victimized, stalked, harassed, knowing there is a weapon involved. This behavior can't go on forever. When is somebody gonna break?
Amanda Harris has moved on with her life, while Cy flounders.
Ironically enough, he decided that medical school wasn't quite right for him.
Cy drops out of podiatry, converts to Christianity, and returns to Houston.
One day he called me and told me that he had obtained a job at a pizza place near my apartment. And I thought, why in the world would he take a job delivering pizzas? And then it dawned on me that he could drive in and out of my apartment complex on the daily, on the hourly sometimes. I found it to be bizarre behavior.
He's a pizza delivery driver. Where being a law enforcement officer wasn't good enough for her, now he's going to drive and deliver pizzas. Not because he wants to, but because it allows him to have the freedom to drive by and check on her whenever he wants to.
In early 2011, 2.5 years after her divorce, Amanda moves to a new home in a new neighborhood and doesn't share her address with Cy. It's a new beginning.
I was encouraged by my friends to get out there, so I put my profile up on an online dating site and I met Wayne.
Wayne Harris works in the motorsports industry and, like Amanda, is divorced with one child, a boy named Nick.
So I met up with him and he thought he was an attractive man and our conversations just flowed so well. I just knew right away. I was so ecstatic to feel this feeling again, to know that I was capable of feeling, you know, the joy, the butterflies again. And he was as well, that we just didn't miss a beat. We decided that we were going to see each other the very next day, which turned into the very next day and every day thereafter, unless he was out of town for work.
And I thought he's just a fantastic guy. Real nice to be around, very energetic.
So Super Bowl Sunday rolled around and Wayne came over that evening and I was cooking and I would oftentimes let Kelsey play at the park right there because I could see her. She's basically within arm's reach of me. So Kelsey's playing, Wayne and I are talking, and I get a knock at the door, and it's the police officer that lives on site. He had received a call from a concerned person letting them know that I let my child play outside unattended.
Amanda invites the officer inside to discuss it, embarrassed that her new boyfriend is a witness.
We all had conversation. Wayne had conversation with him. We were all in agreement that she was certainly within an eye shot, ear shot, arm shot of me and that she was perfectly fine. I asked the officer who had made the call, and he couldn't tell me, but I knew in my gut who was at the root of this. I felt frustrated. I felt violated again. It's a very uneasy feeling to know you're being watched. At this point, my relationship is blossoming with Wayne, and I didn't let him know everything that was going on because I certainly didn't want to taint a good relationship with my baggage and drama. I didn't want to bring that into the relationship.
Amanda's strategy is to block Cy completely.
I figured he didn't get his way. Hopefully he'll move on now, but that never happened. And he knew exactly what button to push, which was going after my daughter.
It has been 5 years since Amanda took custody of Kelsey. Now, as Amanda is on the verge of becoming Kelsey's legal mother, Cy starts to stir things up.
What he did is he cleverly went to a therapist, told the therapist all of his grievance toward me, and made me out to look like a neglectful mother. And it was her duty to call CPS by state law. I received a phone call from CPS that they were going to interview my daughter that day. I felt mortified, and as soon as she stepped foot in my door, she realized quickly that Kelsey was just fine.
I just couldn't believe that he did that. It was like, when does it stop?
Kelsey, the adopted daughter, is the reason she left him in the first place. So by calling CPS, if that worker had not done a thorough and proper investigation or had just rushed to judgment, then Amanda could have very easily lost Kelsey. And for all intents and purposes, her niece, who is now her daughter, is the most important thing she has. And it would have been devastating.
Concerned that Cy's unpredictable behavior is escalating, Amanda seeks help from the local police.
I don't think it's ever going to go away, and I honestly have no idea how to deal with it. I've gone to the police department at this point. I've talked to officers that have asked me to just ignore it, and as long as he doesn't put his hands on me, there's really nothing they can do. It's very frustrating. I felt horribly harassed, unprotected, and you feel so helpless.
Wayne steps up and asks Amanda and Kelsey to move in with him on the other side of Houston.
It was the best feeling. I felt Kelsey was going to have a great role model, a great father figure. Moving to the north side of town was good because I didn't know where I had gone. And so the stalking had come to a halt for a short period of time. Life was actually going really, really well.
It was very, very comforting to know that she was with somebody that was safe, and that Kelsey too.
That all changes one night when Wayne is away on business.
I woke up to gunshots outside of my bedroom window. I knew he was out there.
In 2012, in the Houston suburb of Tomball, Amanda Ghosh is awakened by gunshots outside her window.
I immediately called the police.
She did not see Cy shoot the gun, but she did see him get in the car. When that happened, well, that's when I really became concerned.
When they showed up, he wasn't there. They checked the perimeter of the home. They didn't find any shell casings. They spoke with the neighbors. None of the neighbors had heard any gunshots, and so I kind of felt like they didn't believe me, and it really went nowhere.
Amanda is on high alert, and it's not long before another incident occurs.
One night, Wayne and I were sitting in the living room watching TV, and our dog ran to the window and was barking his tail off. So I knew somebody was out there. And I had a feeling that it was Cy. Wayne hopped up quite angrily, and I encouraged him to just settle down for half a second, let me call the police and get them there this time so that they could witness what was going on. They were right around the corner, so it only took a couple of minutes, and they caught him there. Thank God. This time he had finally been caught, and they issued him a trespass violation and a warning. We actually felt good after that for a while. We didn't see him for quite some time after that.
With Cy in her rear view, Amanda commits to her bright future.
We decided to get married on 12/12/12 at 12/12 at the Justice of the Peace.
They were very, very happy. And in fact, at the time that they got married, they adopted Kelsey at the same time.
I had been fighting for custody of Kelsey for the better part of 7 years. It was quite the process, but we'd finally gotten there. And then 2 days later, I found out I was pregnant for Gemma.
It was great to see. Wayne wrote notes for the unborn baby for her to read later on and, when she grows up. So he was very, very excited about being a new father.
Gemma was born with a very, very rare condition called bacterial association. She was born with only one kidney, as well as no esophagus, a cardiac defect, and a vertebral defect. Needless to say, she required 24/7 attention, care.
She was a perfect little child. Of course, all of my grandkids were perfect. They are a blessing.
About a year and a half after Gemma was born, we moved into this beautiful home that neither one of us thought we would ever be able to live in. And here we achieved it. We were on top of the world at this point. Christmas Day 2015, we woke up rather early with the kiddos because they were just super excited. And we just sat down to open our gifts, and I hear a tap at the door. And who else but Cy?
Cy tells Amanda that he would like to pray with her and her two daughters.
I just couldn't believe that he even came back around, especially at a time when a family's getting together for Christmas.
Wayne came unglued that day. He escorted Cy off of our property with a lot of profanity and a lot of anger and aggression.
Cy's stalking has been going on for almost 6 years, ever since Amanda decided to leave him.
There are some individuals who cannot take no for an answer. They cannot move on and regain their sense of balance until they're back in control again. Maybe if Amanda were to run back to him and he could say, "No, I don't want you," then he would have control again and he could move on. Right now, none of the decisions are his, except the ones that he uses to torture and drive them crazy.
She is aware of Texas's strong stand your ground laws and asks the police for more information about self-defense.
So I asked the officer what my rights were. If I had the right to hold him at citizen's arrest until the police got there. He told me that we definitely had that right.
Wayne owns a gun and suggests Amanda buy one too.
Wayne encouraged me to go get my license to carry and buy a weapon to protect myself due to all of this incessant harassment, stalking. So I took a few classes and tried to become as capable with my weapon as possible. June 28th, 2017 was Kelsey's 11th birthday, and she chose to just have a she day. She chose to do all kinds of things like get her nails done, get her hair done, very girly stuff.
Amanda, Kelsey, and Kelsey's friend Georgia meet up with Wayne, his son Nick, and baby Gemma at Kelsey's favorite restaurant.
And after dinner, Gemma was exhausted, so I asked Wayne to take her back home so that I could finish shopping with Kelsey and her friend for her birthday. So he obliged and reached over and gave me a kiss, a really long kiss. The kids were in the background ewing. I'll forever remember it. I stayed at the mall with Georgia and Kelsey for probably about another hour. Kelsey asked me if her friend could stay the night, and I said sure. So all three of us went back to our home, and as I was rounding the corner of my street, I saw Cy on his hands and knees at my front door with Wayne pointing a gun at him. I knew immediately that I needed to protect my family. I reached into my glove box, I grabbed my gun, and I told the girls to sit down and not to move. I got out of the car, I held the gun in that direction, and I called the police.
Hi, I need a police officer as soon as possible. I'm making
Hold on.
a arrest right now.
You can't make a citizen's arrest.
Yes, I've already been informed that I can. I have an ongoing case against this person.
Ma'am.
Get down! Get down!
Who is this man to you?
He is my ex-husband.
On June 28, 2017, Jennifer Provoznik is visiting friends who live down the street from where Amanda and Wayne live.
I work in law enforcement, and it's my day off, so I just wanted to really enjoy my day with my friends.
They are oblivious to the scene unfolding a couple of yards away.
My name is Amanda Harris. I've been down there many times to tell you guys what's going on. He's been told by the police to stay away hundreds of times.
Do you have a weapon right now?
My husband and I both have a weapon.
Okay, I'm going to need you to put that weapon up, ma'am.
Okay.
Okay, you and your husband both.
Wayne, he wants you to put your weapon down.
Does this other male have a weapon?
I have no idea.
From inside the car, 11-year-old Kelsey also calls 911.
Send him over right now, please.
What's going on?
My mom's ex-husband, he literally stalks us and he's at our house right now. My parents are yelling at him right now. It's done. I'm sorry. I'm just really scared.
For me, I'm getting tired of you. Stay on the
And I hear 3 distinct gunshots and a woman screaming. So at this time, my training kicks in, and I told my friend, I was like, listen, call 911. I'm going down there.
I had been shot, but I didn't know it. It was all so surreal. I saw my husband fall to the ground out of the corner of my eye. And as I sat up from the position I was in, I was shot again. And I was laying between the 2 cars when I saw Sai's feet moving around the car and circle back to me. And when I looked up, he was holding a gun at my head, and he pulled the trigger. But it didn't fire. I had been saved by the grace of God. It didn't fire. And some divine force picked me up, and I got to my feet and I ran for my life.
I see a woman running into the house and slamming the door. And then there's this guy just standing there in between 2 cars, looking around. And he looks right at me and then takes off running.
Sai Ghosh gets in a car and flees the scene.
And that's when a little girl gets out of the car. She looks at me and she starts screaming, "Save my daddy." And I look down, there's a body in the driveway. And I was like, listen, I said, there's a woman behind me. You take your friend. You do not stop till you get to her. Do you understand me? And she goes, yes. And so I sent her off at that point. I look at the individual on the ground, and I knew there was no point of me even attempting CPR or any other life-saving matters.
All I could think is he's gonna fire through this door. And I realized in that moment that I had left Kelsey in the back seat of the car. I ran back out the front door, and I was met by a very kind lady.
I know that she's wounded and she's also in shock. She's yelling about her babies being missing. She's also screaming, I knew he would do something like this. I knew it. And then she notices the man in the driveway.
She kindly grabbed me by my arm. That's when I realized I'd been shot in my arm. And she walked me over to his body. And I was able to say goodbye to my husband. And they were putting me in an ambulance shortly thereafter.
When police arrive, they find 5-year-old Gemma and 17-year-old Nick hiding in a closet. That's when Amanda's father drops by on his way home to say happy birthday to Kelsey.
As I got out of the car, there was 3 or 4 policemen that came up to me. And the first thing they said was, Amanda's in the hospital, but she's okay. She's been shot, but she's going to be okay. And right at that point, that's when my heart just fell. And the first thing I thought of was the kids. Are the kids okay? What happened? And they said, yeah, the kids are here. They're with some of the neighbors that are here. And then I said, well, what about Wayne? That's when they continued to tell me he didn't make it.
We begin with that breaking news alert out of League City. A man police initially wanted for questioning is now wanted for murder.
We were the first news crew on the scene. We're getting there, and it's the chaos of the scene because you have a gunman on the run, you have dead body and someone seriously wounded, and everyone's trying to figure out what happened.
They put the hospital on lockdown because Cy was on the run.
I was at her bedside the whole time. I don't know, it's like a movie, a bad movie. It was a horrible nightmare.
So as this statewide manhunt is going on, police had reason to believe that Cy was going to try to run for the border. And it was a checkpoint in El Paso. They were able to identify that Cy was trying to cross. There wasn't much of a resistance. At that point, even Cy had figured out that this was over and he was going to be taken into custody. When they look inside the vehicle, they do find a gun. They find several clips with bullets inside where the casings match the 12 that were found on scene of the shooting back in Lake City.
I don't know how I made it through. I really don't. But I have children and they needed me and life didn't stop. I had to get out of bed every day. I had to accept that he was never coming back. Thank God for my children. I stayed in the house until the trial came, and it took us 2 years to go to trial.
As the family tries to heal, Amanda assumes the only time she will ever have to encounter Cy again is in court. But she is wrong.
But one day I get this phone call and I can clearly see that it's the jail on my caller ID. So I turn on the voice recorder and I took the phone call.
Hello?
Hello?
I just want to apologize to you. I'm sorry for everything, Amanda. I'm really sorry.
Is this a joke?
No, I just want to apologize.
You almost killed me. Is this a joke?
No, Amanda, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I got scared.
Got scared?
I could not believe that I was listening to this person on the other end of the phone. How is this even allowed? Who is running this jail and allowing a murderer to call his victim?
I just want to pray with you guys. I'll put you on the phone real quick before we go to trial. Can I pray with you? Please, Jesus, please comfort Amanda. Please help me never harm her, never to cause her problems again.
Cy's staggering ability to keep harassing Amanda will even continue through the trial itself.
So I was charged with murder in the first degree, aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, and stalking.
In the middle of the case, Cy fires his defense attorney and decides he's going to defend himself now.
But I know that he wanted to get me on the stand and question me. And that was his way of doing it. He was able to question me for a very long period of time.
Cy thought that Amanda was going to wilt on the stand. That's not what happened.
Amanda comes through this a hero. The fact that she does not cave, that she looks him straight in the eye and answers his questions. So if he wanted control, he didn't get it. He got to talk to her, but he didn't get the responses, the feeling, the control that he was seeking. So in that case, Amanda comes out a winner.
I don't know how the law allows your attacker to question you. How is that even possible? But it happened.
After the trial wraps up, the jury is quick to return guilty verdicts. And on March 5th, 2020, Cy is sentenced to 50 years in prison. He will be eligible for parole after serving 25 years.
I was disappointed because I feel like he should have gotten life without the possibility of parole. I truly believe that if he were to walk the streets again, if he were to ever get out, that he will kill me. He will finish the job.
I hope he never gets out, and all I can do is just say, let Jesus take the wheel. Even though I'm that close to her, I can't imagine going through what she went through. But we get through it every day. It's a process where we're all working through it.
I was angry with the police. I feel like they failed my family, and I think Cy Ghosh is pure evil. But there's still a big life to live, and I choose to just be happy. We have what, 40? I have 40 summers left. I'm gonna make the best of the 40 summers I have left. Wayne wouldn't want me to waste them.
The concept of the American suburb in the mid-20th century was built upon a foundation of tranquility, predictability, and safety. It was a world where manicured lawns, quiet streets, and the polite distance between neighbors created an illusion of absolute security. In Houston, Texas, during the sweltering early summer of 1965, this illusion was perfectly maintained on Driscoll Street. It was a neighborhood where people kept to themselves, respecting the boundaries of private property and private lives. Behind the closed doors of these modest homes, families lived out their daily routines, shielded from the watchful eyes of the outside world. However, this very privacy, this profound isolation hidden beneath the veneer of suburban normalcy, can sometimes act as a dark incubator. It provides a perfect, undisturbed environment for deep-seated resentment to fester, for familial bonds to curdle into hatred, and for unimaginable horrors to be meticulously planned and executed without anyone noticing until it is far too late. The year 1965 was a time of shifting cultural landscapes in America, yet the fundamental traditions remained deeply rooted in the social fabric. Among these was the observance of Father's Day, a Sunday dedicated to honoring the patriarchs of the family, a day typically marked by gatherings, shared meals, and expressions of gratitude. In June of that year, the date fell on the 20th. For the vast majority of households across the nation, it was a day of familial warmth. But for the residents of 1815 Driscoll Street, an elderly couple named Fred and Edwina Rogers, this particular Father's Day would not be a celebration of life or legacy. Instead, it would mark the violent termination of their existence, transforming their quiet residence into one of the most macabre and haunting crime scenes in the history of the United States. Fred, aged 81, and Edwina, aged 72, were in the twilight of their lives, a time generally associated with peaceful rest, yet they were about to be consumed by a nightmare born within their own walls. In the days immediately following that Sunday, a heavy, undisturbed silence fell over the house at 1815 Driscoll Street. The Texas summer heat beat down on the roof, but inside, there was no movement, no sound of daily life, no signs of the elderly couple going about their usual routines. To the outside world, the house simply looked quiet, perhaps a little too quiet, but not inherently suspicious. Neighbors, accustomed to the family's reclusive nature, thought nothing of the lack of activity. However, the absence of communication eventually began to trigger alarms for those slightly closer to the couple. A nephew, attempting to reach out to his aging relatives, found his telephone calls echoing endlessly into a void. The persistent ringing, day after day, went unanswered. As June the 20th passed into the 21st, and then the 22nd, minor annoyance slowly shifted into genuine, creeping anxiety. By the 23rd of June, 3 days after the silence began, the nephew's concern reached a tipping point, prompting him to contact the Houston authorities to request a routine welfare check on the elderly couple. When the police officers arrived at the address on that Wednesday, they were operating under the assumption of a standard, albeit potentially unfortunate, domestic call. Officers routinely check on elderly citizens who have fallen out of contact with their families. The expectation in such scenarios is usually mundane: a slipped fall, a sudden medical emergency like a heart attack or a stroke, or simply a broken telephone line. As the officers approached the front of the house, nothing about the exterior suggested that a tragedy of monumental proportions had occurred. The house stood exactly as it always had, ordinary and unassuming. The officers knocked on the doors, their heavy raps echoing through the quiet neighborhood, but they were met with the same profound silence that had alarmed the nephew. Recognizing that the occupants were either unable to answer or absent, and bound by their duty to ensure the well-being of the vulnerable residents, the decision was made to force entry. They broke the lock and stepped over the threshold, moving from the oppressive, humid heat of the Houston afternoon into the still, shaded interior of the Rogers residence. What greeted the officers upon entering was not the foul odor of decay, nor was it the chaotic disarray of a home invasion or a violent struggle. The psychological expectation of a crime scene involves overturned furniture, shattered glass, scattered belongings, or the unmistakable scent of a body left to the elements. Instead, the officers were met with an environment that defied all their professional instincts. The house was clean. It was not just tidy, it was sterile, organized, and maintained with an eerie, almost obsessive level of precision. Every surface appeared to have been wiped down, every item placed deliberately in its designated spot. This unnatural cleanliness immediately created a sense of cognitive dissonance. A house occupied by an octogenarian and a septuagenarian should possess the natural clutter of a long life lived within its walls. The absolute lack of dust, the absence of any signs of recent human activity, and the suffocating stillness felt deeply wrong, painting a picture of deliberate erasure rather than domestic peace. The officers moved slowly through the rooms, their footsteps sounding unnaturally loud against the pristine floors. They checked the living areas, the bedrooms, and the bathrooms, finding no trace of Fred or Edwina Rogers. The elderly couple had seemingly vanished into thin air, leaving behind a home that looked as though it were prepared for an open house rather than everyday living. The tension among the investigators began to mount, an unspoken realization settling over them that something deeply sinister was concealed behind the facade of this immaculate home. The investigation eventually led them into the kitchen, a room traditionally considered the heart of a house, a place of nourishment and warmth. In this house, however, the kitchen maintained the same cold, clinical perfection as the rest of the dwelling. It was in this remarkably clean kitchen that the grim reality of 1815, Driscoll Street, would finally reveal itself, triggered by an act so painfully ordinary it underscores the horror of the situation. As the officers stood in the silent room, the stifling ambient heat of the unair-conditioned house pressing in on them, one of the investigators decided to open the refrigerator. The intention was entirely mundane. Whether he was simply continuing a thorough, methodical search of every enclosed space within the residence, or perhaps absent-mindedly looking for a cold bottle of water or a chilled beverage to combat the Texas heat, the act of pulling the refrigerator door handle was the catalyst that would shatter their reality. The heavy door swung open, the internal light flickering to life, illuminating the shelves and releasing a wave of artificially chilled air into the warm kitchen. The human brain is naturally wired to recognize patterns and make sense of familiar environments. When looking into a household refrigerator, one expects to see cartons of milk, leftover meals stored in glass containers, fresh produce, and ordinary groceries. What the officer saw, however, immediately rejected any attempt at normal categorization. Arranged on the wire shelves, stacked with a sickening level of care and precision, were dozens of transparent plastic bags. At first glance, it might have looked like a massive stockpile of meat from a local butcher. But as the officer's eyes adjusted to the light and the mind processed the visual information, the chilling truth began to form. The meat inside these clear plastic bags was not ordinary livestock. It had been processed, portioned, and wrapped with a deeply unsettling, methodical expertise. Furthermore, the contents of the bags were entirely devoid of blood. Every single piece of flesh had been washed meticulously clean, drained entirely of its life fluids before being carefully sealed in the plastic and placed into the cold storage. A heavy, suffocating dread settled over the kitchen. The clinical presentation of the bags, the sheer volume of them, and the absolute lack of any mess or contamination within the appliance pointed to a perpetrator who possessed not just malice, but an icy, terrifying composure. This was not a crime of sudden, blind passion that leaves a chaotic, blood-soaked room in its wake. This was a calculated, industrial-scale butchery performed within the confines of a suburban home, followed by an agonizingly thorough cleanup process. The officer, paralyzed by the sight of the neatly stacked bags of pale, clean flesh, allowed his gaze to drift downward, moving past the meticulously arranged shelves toward the bottom of the appliance. There, at the very base of the refrigerator, sat the crisper drawers, the compartments universally designed and utilized for storing fresh vegetables and fragile produce to maintain their humidity and prolong their shelf life. The clear plastic front of the bottom drawer offered a direct, unobstructed view into its contents. As the officer looked down, the final, devastating piece of the nightmare fell into place. Resting inside the vegetable bin, entirely separated from the rest of her form, was the severed head of 72-year-old Edwina Rogers. She had been subjected to the same horrifying treatment as the rest of the contents. Her face, framed by the plastic walls of the crisper drawer, was positioned in such a way that she appeared to be looking outward. Her eyes were open, frozen in a permanent, wide, unblinking stare that pierced through the cold glass and plastic, locking onto the horrified gaze of the man who had just opened the door. The profound silence of the impeccably clean house was instantly shattered by the visceral, involuntary scream of the seasoned police officer. The sound tore through the quiet suburban atmosphere, a raw vocalization of pure, unadulterated terror that marked the exact moment the illusion of 1815 Driscoll Street was completely destroyed. The residence was no longer just a home where an elderly couple had failed to answer the phone. It was a slaughterhouse disguised by domestic perfection. The immediate aftermath of that scream brought an avalanche of horrifying questions crashing down upon the investigating authorities. If the woman in the vegetable crisper was Edwina Rogers, where were the remains of her 81-year-old husband, Fred? Furthermore, the sheer logistics of the crime scene defied easy explanation. The process of dismantling two adult human bodies, washing the remains so thoroughly, packaging them with such clinical precision, and obliterating every single microscopic drop of blood from the surrounding environment required hours, perhaps days, of uninterrupted, agonizingly focused labor. Who could possess the anatomical knowledge required to execute such a flawless dismemberment? Who could maintain the psychological detachment necessary to stand in a domestic bathroom, methodically processing the bodies of an elderly couple, and then painstakingly scrubbing the tiles until they gleamed, all while the brutalized remains chilled in the kitchen appliance mere steps away? The answers to these questions would soon introduce investigators to the phantom of the Rogers household, a man whose existence was barely registered by the surrounding community. He was the prime suspect, a ghost living in the attic, a brilliant but deeply eccentric 43-year-old geophysicist and former Navy pilot named Charles Rogers, the sole surviving son of the slaughtered couple. And just like the blood that had been meticulously washed down the drains of the family home, Charles Rogers had vanished completely, evaporating into thin air without leaving a single trace behind, setting in motion a mystery that would endure for decades. To understand the sheer magnitude of the horror discovered inside the refrigerator at 1815 Driscoll Street, one must first look past the gruesome remnants of the crime scene and deeply examine the profoundly disturbed ecosystem that existed within the walls of that house. The neighborhood surrounding the residence presented a flawless picture of mid-century American suburban tranquility, a place where manicured lawns and polite distance defined the social contract. However, homes are essentially containers for the human experience, absorbing the energies, the resentments, and the toxic dynamics of the people who inhabit them. The Rogers residence was not a sanctuary of familial warmth or a peaceful retreat for an elderly couple in their twilight years. It was, instead, a subterranean psychological prison, a deeply fractured environment where traditional family roles had warped into something unrecognizable, hostile, and ultimately fatal. The victims of this unprecedented butchery, 81-year-old Fred Rogers and his 72-year-old wife Edwina, were not merely innocent bystanders who fell prey to a random act of violence. They were the architects and the active participants in a bizarre, suffocating domestic structure that had been steadily accumulating pressure for decades. At the very center of this toxic household dynamic was the patriarch, Fred Rogers. In the broader cultural narrative, an 81-year-old grandfather is often stereotyped as a figure of gentle wisdom, a physically fragile elder deserving of quiet respect and tender care. Fred Rogers violently defied this comforting archetype. He was, by fundamental nature, an intensely abrasive, deeply angry, and highly volatile man. His disposition was not something that had merely soured with the onset of old age. It was a lifelong character trait defined by cruelty and a relentless desire for dominance. Behind the closed doors of their Houston home, Fred ruled his family with a dictatorial and heavy hand. His particular brand of fatherhood was heavily characterized by violence and intimidation. This was not a dynamic of occasional stern discipline, but rather a persistent, suffocating atmosphere of emotional and physical abuse. The primary target of this lifelong campaign of cruelty was his only son, Charles Rogers. The abuse Charles suffered at the hands of his father was not a recent development. It was a foundational element of his existence, stretching all the way back into the vulnerable years of his early childhood. Fred had spent a lifetime systematically breaking down his son, establishing a hierarchy of fear that remained terrifyingly intact even as Charles grew into adulthood. The true tragedy and the most baffling paradox of the Rogers family lay in the stark contrast between Charles's external capabilities and his internal subjugation. At 43 years old, Charles Rogers was, on paper, a highly accomplished and exceptionally capable individual. He was not a helpless dependent incapable of navigating the world. During the global conflict of the Second World War, he had served his country with distinction as a pilot in the United States Navy, a role that inherently demands a high degree of physical coordination, mental fortitude, grace under extreme pressure, and immense personal courage. Following his military service, he had further proven his intellectual prowess by becoming a geophysicist, a highly specialized scientific field requiring deep analytical thought and a rigorous understanding of the Earth's most complex systems. Furthermore, Charles possessed a sharp acumen for business. He had leveraged his intellect into highly successful land investments, amassing a significant personal fortune, and achieving a level of financial independence that most people only dream of. Yet, despite possessing the bravery to pilot naval aircraft, the intelligence to master geophysics, and the financial resources to live wherever and however he pleased, Charles remained hopelessly tethered to his childhood bedroom, completely paralyzed by the psychological chains forged by his father. The financial success that Charles had achieved independently did not serve as his ticket to freedom. Instead, it became yet another weapon utilized by his parents to maintain their absolute control over him. Despite his wealth, he was systematically drained of his assets by the very people who should have supported his independence. Fred and Edwina engaged in a relentless campaign of financial extortion against their own son. They ruthlessly exploited his deep-seated psychological conditioning, utilizing the fear instilled during his abusive childhood to bleed him of his earnings. The dynamic went far beyond simple manipulation. It involved over-coercion. Charles was frequently forced, under the immense, crushing pressure of his father's volatile temper and dominant personality, to sign over legal and financial documents against his will. His vast intelligence and military training offered absolutely no defense against the insidious, paralyzing grip of lifelong familial abuse. He was a brilliant, wealthy man reduced to a state of terrified compliance, trapped in a relentless cycle of financial exploitation that he felt utterly powerless to stop. The money he earned through his own intellect and labor was constantly funneled into the hands of his abusers, solidifying his imprisonment within the walls of the Driscoll Street house. While Fred Rogers operated as the overtly aggressive tyrant of the household, Edwina Rogers played a role that was equally crucial to the maintenance of this deeply abnormal environment. As a mother, she might have been expected to act as a shield, a nurturing force, or an intervening presence against her husband's lifelong violence. Instead, the reality of her relationship with her 43-year-old son was characterized by an extreme, almost unfathomable degree of emotional detachment and physical alienation. The most chilling manifestation of this estrangement was their chosen method of daily communication. Inside a house where they both lived, slept, and breathed the same air, there were absolutely no spoken words exchanged between mother and son. They did not share morning greetings, they did not argue, and they did not engage in casual conversation. Their entire relationship had devolved into a silent, spectral exchange. To communicate with her son, Edwina would write her thoughts, demands, or messages onto small slips of paper. She would then carry these handwritten notes through the quiet house and slide them silently beneath the small gap under Charles's closed bedroom door. Charles, in turn, would respond in the exact same manner, pushing his own written replies back through the crack. This physical barrier of the wooden door was a perfect, heartbreaking metaphor for the impenetrable emotional wall that stood between them. They were blood relatives sharing a single address, yet they interacted with the cold, sterile distance of hostile prisoners in solitary confinement. This profound isolation extended far beyond the strange note-passing ritual. Charles Rogers had effectively engineered his own disappearance while remaining entirely visible to his parents. He lived his life as a phantom, a ghost haunting the corridors of his own home. He engaged in an extreme form of avoidance, restructuring his entire existence to guarantee that he would never have to cross paths with Fred or Edwina. He absolutely refused to share meals with them, treating the communal spaces of the house as heavily contaminated zones to be avoided at all costs. To the outside world, this isolation was so successful that it bordered on the supernatural. The neighbors who lived in the adjacent houses on Driscoll Street, people who water their lawns and walk their dogs just yards away from the Rogers property, were completely oblivious to Charles's existence. They knew the elderly couple, Fred and Edwina, but they had absolutely no idea that a 43-year-old man was also residing behind those walls. Charles achieved this total invisibility by adopting an exclusively nocturnal lifestyle. When he needed to leave the confines of a stifling bedroom, he did so only under the heavy cover of darkness. He would slip out of the house in the dead of night or the very early, pre-dawn hours of the morning. Furthermore, he avoided the front door entirely, opting instead to navigate through the dusty, hidden expanse of the attic or slipping silently out through the obscured back entrance of the property. He moved through his own life with the stealth and caution of a hunted animal, terrified of waking the predators that slept just down the hall. The house at 1815 Driscoll Street was, therefore, not a home in any traditional sense. It was a meticulously maintained theater of psychological warfare, a pressure cooker built on a foundation of extreme abuse, financial extortion, and absolute silence. It was an environment where three deeply damaged individuals occupied the same physical structure while inhabiting entirely separate, intensely hostile universes. The air inside the house must have been permanently thick with unexpressed rage, lifelong resentments, and the suffocating weight of total dysfunction. Decades of Fred's cruel domination, coupled with Edwina's cold complicity and the ongoing theft of Charles's hard-earned wealth, had created an atmosphere that was inherently unsustainable. The human mind, even one as brilliant and disciplined as a geophysicist and former Navy pilot, can only endure a certain threshold of continuous trauma before the internal mechanisms begin to fracture and fail. The absolute silence that characterized their daily lives was not a sign of peace. It was the terrifying stillness that precedes a catastrophic detonation. The stage was perfectly set for an explosion of violence that would obliterate the facade of suburban normalcy forever. This deeply disturbing familial background, characterized by a lifetime of silent torment and psychological subjugation, is the crucial lens through which the gruesome events of Father's Day must be viewed. The meticulous, bloodless horror found within the kitchen appliance was not a random anomaly, but rather the grim, inevitable harvest of seeds that had been planted and violently nurtured within that house for over 4 decades. The calendar marked June the 20th, 1965, as Father's Day across the United States. In the surrounding neighborhoods of Houston, families were gathering to celebrate the patriarchs of their households, sharing meals, offering gifts, and enjoying the suffocating yet familiar warmth of the early Texas summer. The irony of this specific date, serving as the backdrop for the events at 1815 Driscoll Street, is profoundly bitter. Within the heavily fortified psychological walls of the Rogers residence, there was no celebration, no gratitude, and absolutely no warmth. Instead, decades of silent torment, financial extortion, and deeply ingrained emotional abuse had finally reached critical mass. The exact sequence of events, the specific argument, or the silent trigger that initiated the violence will forever remain known only to the dead and the phantom who vanished shortly thereafter. However, the forensic evidence left behind provides a chillingly clear narrative of how the tension finally broke. The eruption of violence within the house was not a simple, impulsive act. It was a catastrophic release of a lifetime of suppressed rage, manifesting in a double homicide of unimaginable brutality and shocking methodical precision. The autopsy reports conducted in the aftermath of the discovery would eventually reveal a story of 2 distinct, highly personalized murders occurring within the same domestic space. The attack on 81-year-old Fred Rogers was a testament to pure, unadulterated hatred. This was not a killing motivated by a desire to simply end a life. It was an act designed to obliterate, humiliate, and punish the victim. The weapon chosen to end the life of the family patriarch was a heavy, steel claw hammer. The forensic pathology indicated that Fred was beaten savagely, subjected to a barrage of crushing blows that shattered bone and destroyed tissue. The sheer physical force required to inflict such damage speaks to an attacker driven by an adrenaline-fueled frenzy, a profound desire to physically dismantle the man who had ruled the household with a heavy, abusive hand for over 4 decades. Every strike of the hammer was seemingly infused with the resentment of a lifetime spent in subjugation and fear. However, the blunt force trauma was only the beginning of the horrors inflicted upon Fred Rogers. The killer engaged in acts of post-mortem or peri-mortem mutilation that elevate the crime from a domestic homicide to an act of profound psychological vengeance. The autopsy revealed that the elderly man's eyes had been violently gouged out of his skull. In the context of behavioral analysis, the blinding of a victim is often interpreted as a deeply symbolic act, an attempt to permanently extinguish the judgmental, controlling gaze of an abuser. Furthermore, the patriarch was brutally castrated. This specific, horrific mutilation is almost universally recognized as the ultimate act of emasculation and domination. By removing the very symbol of his father's manhood and authority, the killer completely stripped Fred Rogers of his power, reducing the lifelong tyrant to a desecrated, broken shell. The rage directed at Fred was intimate, visceral, and horrifyingly specific, completely eradicating the man who had caused so much suffering. In stark contrast to the frenzied, deeply intimate obliteration of the father, the murder of 72-year-old Edwina Rogers was executed with a chilling, sudden finality. There was no prolonged beating, no symbolic mutilation, and no evidence of a frantic struggle. Edwina was simply shot directly in the head. The profound difference in the methods of execution provides a dark window into the killer's psychological relationship with each parent. If Fred was the active, violent tormentor who required total physical and symbolic destruction, Edwina was the cold, detached enabler who had participated in the silent, suffocating communication beneath the bedroom door. The single gunshot was an efficient, almost clinical method of permanently ending her complicity and severing the silent, spectral bond they shared. The bullet abruptly terminated the strange ritual of sliding notes beneath the floorboards, silencing her forever with a terrifying efficiency that starkly juxtaposed the chaotic ruin inflicted upon her husband. Once the violent storm of the double homicide had passed, an unnatural, heavy silence reclaimed the house on Driscoll Street. 2 bodies now lay bleeding within the pristine suburban home, the immediate aftermath of decades of dysfunction culminating in absolute ruin. It is at this precise juncture in the timeline that the nature of the crime shifts dramatically. The blinding, chaotic rage that fueled the slaughter of Fred Rogers evaporated, replaced instantly by an icy, terrifyingly calculated composure. The perpetrator transitioned seamlessly from an uncontrollable force of violence into a methodical, emotionless technician. The chaotic reality of 2 battered corpses was immediately perceived not as a tragedy, but as a complex logistical problem that required a highly systematic solution. The house, entirely isolated from the oblivious neighborhood outside, was rapidly transformed from a crime scene into an improvised, industrial-scale processing facility. The heavy, lifeless forms of Fred and Edwina were dragged from the locations of their respective murders into the confined, sterile space of the household bathroom. The porcelain bathtub, an object designed for cleansing and relaxation, was repurposed into an abattoir. The first crucial step in the perpetrator's meticulous plan involved the complete exsanguination of the bodies. Before any further dismantling could occur, the blood had to be drained entirely to prevent rapid decomposition and to control the inevitable biological mess. This process was not carried out with frantic, desperate hacking, but rather with a sickening, deliberate patience. The blood of the elderly couple was systematically drained out, washing down the drain of the porcelain tub, disappearing into the subterranean plumbing of the city, leaving the remaining flesh pale and entirely devoid of its vital fluids. With the bodies fully drained, the process of dismemberment began. The tool utilized for this gruesome task was not a heavy cleaver or a motorized saw, but a simple, manually operated handsaw. The sheer physical stamina, cardiovascular endurance, and relentless psychological detachment required to manually saw through human bone, muscle, and sinew for hours on end are almost incomprehensible. Yet, the killer performed this task with an expertise that stunned seasoned medical examiners. The forensic analysis of the severed joints and bones indicated that the dismemberment was executed by someone possessing an intimate, highly sophisticated understanding of human anatomy. The cuts were not random or jagged. They were precise, locating the joints and severing the limbs with the measured, flawless accuracy of a surgeon. This professional approach to the dismantling of the bodies aligns perfectly with the background of a man trained in the rigorous physical and mathematical disciplines of naval aviation and geophysics. He approached the biological matter of his parents exactly as he would approach a complex mechanical or geological puzzle, breaking them down into manageable components with terrifying efficiency. The disposal of the soft tissues and internal organs presents one of the most grotesque and surreal elements of the entire incident. Recognizing that the organs would decompose rapidly and create an unmanageable odor, the killer needed a method of immediate eradication. The solution was as mundane as it was horrifying. The internal organs of both Fred and Edwina were systematically removed, carried to the bathroom toilet, and flushed away piece by piece. This relentless disposal of biological material continued for hours, utilizing the household plumbing to secretly transport the evidence of the slaughter away from the property. However, the sheer volume of the discarded organs proved to be too much for the aging infrastructure of the Houston neighborhood. The massive influx of human tissue entering the pipes actually caused a severe blockage in the underground sewer system of the entire street. While the neighbors of Driscoll Street went about their Father's Day weekend, entirely unaware of the massacre occurring just yards away, they unknowingly experienced the physical runoff of the crime as their neighborhood plumbing mysteriously backed up and failed. Following the painstaking dismemberment and the disposal of the internal organs, the perpetrator faced the monumental task of total decontamination. The bathroom, which had served as the site of the exsanguination and butchery, along with any other areas of the house exposed to the violence, had to be completely sterilized. The killer utilized heavy chemical cleaners, bleach, and harsh detergents, scrubbing the floors, the walls, the porcelain tub, and the tile grout with an obsessive, relentless vigor. The goal was not merely to make the house look tidy, but to completely obliterate any microscopic trace of blood or biological material. This degree of cleaning required hours of agonizing, back-breaking labor, performed while the dismembered, bloodless remains of his parents sat in the very same house. The result was a chillingly sterile environment, an immaculate facade that completely masked the butchery that had just occurred, successfully deceiving the police officers who would initially breach the home days later. The final stage of this unprecedented domestic horror involved the preservation and storage of the processed remains. The killer had deliberately purchased a large quantity of extra ice in advance, a clear indication of chilling premeditation and a calculated timeline for escape. The severed pieces of flesh, having been completely drained of blood and meticulously washed clean of any remaining residue, were carefully placed into individual, transparent plastic bags. The air was squeezed out, and the bags were sealed tightly. These packages were then carried into the kitchen and stacked onto the wire shelves of the family refrigerator with the neat, organized precision of a commercial butcher stocking a display case. The addition of the extra ice ensured that the remains would be kept artificially cold, significantly slowing the natural process of decomposition and buying the killer the maximum amount of time before the inevitable odor would alert the outside world. The absolute culmination of the incident, the final act before the perpetrator vanished into the humid Texas air, involved the placement of Edwina's head. Rather than wrapping it alongside the other remains, her severed head was carried to the bottom of the refrigerator and placed directly inside the clear plastic vegetable crisper drawer. It was positioned deliberately, facing outward, her wide, unblinking eyes staring perpetually through the transparent plastic barrier. This final, macabre arrangement transformed a completely ordinary household appliance into a monument of terror. Once the heavy door of the refrigerator was sealed shut, the artificial chill locking the nightmare inside, The killer gathered whatever resources were necessary and silently exited the house. He left behind a perfectly clean, terrifyingly quiet home, locking the doors and walking away from 1815 Driscoll Street forever, leaving the horrors of Father's Day waiting in the dark for whoever was unfortunate enough to finally come looking. The discovery of the remains in the refrigerator at 1815 Driscoll Street did not merely mark the conclusion of a welfare check. It initiated an investigation of such overwhelming proportions that it instantly paralyzed the local authorities and demanded an immediate, nationwide response. The scene inside the kitchen was so clinically organized, so devoid of the chaotic evidence typically left behind by a violent crime, that it defied the standard methodologies of mid-60s police work. Houston detectives, accustomed to the raw, messy reality of street-level homicide, found themselves standing in a space that felt less like a crime scene and more like a carefully constructed installation of horror. The immediate priority was, of course, the identification of the perpetrator, and the investigation converged with laser-like focus on the only person who possessed the physical access, the technical knowledge, and the proximity to carry out such a task: the son, Charles Rogers. The investigators began their work by reconstructing the timeline of the final days of the Rogers household. They needed to understand how the perpetrator had managed to live in such close proximity to the gruesome project without raising the slightest suspicion among the neighbors. The search for evidence expanded rapidly from the kitchen to the rest of the house, but the methodical nature of the cleanup made this an incredibly frustrating endeavor. The police discovered that the killer had not just cleaned the obvious surfaces, he had scrubbed the entire house with a level of intensity that suggested he was attempting to erase his very existence from the structure. There were no stray hairs, no missed droplets of blood, and no signs of a physical struggle that might have left behind DNA or trace evidence. The investigators were forced to confront a terrifying reality. The killer had left behind only what he intended them to find, and he had cleaned away everything else. As the detectives delved into the life of Charles Rogers, they uncovered a history of extreme intellectual capability, combined with an increasingly reclusive and erratic lifestyle. His background as a United States Navy pilot during the Second World War was, to the investigators, a critical piece of the puzzle. This training had provided him with a unique set of skills that explain the surgical precision found in the kitchen. A pilot requires the ability to remain calm under extreme pressure, to navigate complex systems with perfect accuracy, and to possess a high degree of situational awareness. These were not the traits of a panicked criminal, but those of a man who could systematically dismantle a problem into its component parts and execute a plan without deviation. When combined with his advanced degree in geophysics, the investigators were dealing with a suspect who possessed the analytical mind to view the butchery not as a moral transgression, but as a technical operation. The investigation hit a significant, impenetrable wall when it came to tracking the movements of Charles Rogers after the presumed time of the murders. The police issued a national alert, putting the description of the 43-year-old on every desk in the country. They looked for financial transactions, for vehicles registered in his name, and for any communication that might indicate his location. Yet, the man had vanished with a completeness that seemed almost impossible for the era. He had left behind his personal vehicle, his bank accounts, and even significant assets that he had spent years accumulating. This was not the flight of a man who had panicked and run in the heat of the moment. This was the deliberate, planned disappearance of someone who understood how to move through the world unseen. The investigators hypothesized that he had either taken his own life in a way that left no body, or that he had possessed the resources and the connections to adopt a new identity and leave the country entirely. The detectives conducted hundreds of interviews, hoping to find a neighbor, a former colleague, or an acquaintance who might have seen Charles during the days immediately following the Father's Day weekend. The results were universally disappointing. The neighbors, who had lived on either side of the Rogers residence for years, provided nothing but a collective blank slate. They described the couple as reclusive, but they consistently stated that they had never even seen Charles, nor were they aware that a third adult resided in the house. This absolute invisibility confirmed the theory that Charles had spent his entire adult life moving like a phantom within his own home, navigating through attics and back entrances to avoid any human interaction. The investigators began to realize that they were not hunting a man who was hiding. They were hunting a man who had never truly lived in the public sphere, making his ability to disappear even more formidable. The forensic analysis of the remains and the house continued, producing results that only deepened the investigators' confusion. They found no fingerprints that did not belong to the victims, and they found no tools that could be definitively linked to the dismemberment. The kitchen, the site of the most horrifying discovery, was devoid of any trace of the person who had stacked the bags with such cold, clinical precision. The investigators worked through the nights, attempting to map out the exact movements of the killer as he went about the gruesome task of scrubbing the house, flushing the organs, and arranging the remains. They were struck by the sheer physical labor involved. The process had to have taken days of intense, uninterrupted work, yet the house remained quiet, and no neighbor reported seeing or hearing anything unusual. The silence of the neighborhood had become the killer's greatest accomplice. The investigation reached a critical juncture when the police began to examine the financial records that the victims had been so ruthlessly collecting from their son. They discovered a pattern of systemic exploitation that provided the most plausible motive for the crime. Charles had been forced to sign over documents and hand over his earnings to his parents for years. The investigators theorized that the murder was not just an act of vengeance for a childhood of abuse, but a desperate, final attempt by Charles to reclaim his autonomy and terminate the financial hostage situation that had dominated his adult life. However, even with a clear motive, the detectives could not bridge the gap between the motive and the act of disappearance. They could not find a single person who had seen Charles after the murders occurred. He had effectively evaporated, leaving behind a vacuum where his life should have been. As the weeks and months turned into years, the investigation into the Rogers murders transitioned from an active manhunt to a cold case. The police were forced to acknowledge that they had exhausted every lead. They had reached out to the FBI, they had checked international transit records, and they had monitored every location where a man with Charles's background might seek refuge. They were met with nothing. The mystery of the Icebox murders became a haunting presence in the annals of Houston law enforcement. Every time the police faced an unsolved, brutal domestic homicide, the case of Fred and Edwina Rogers was cited as the ultimate example of the cold, calculated efficiency that some perpetrators could achieve. The detectives who had initially breached the door at 1815 Driscoll Street were forever marked by what they had seen, and they lived the rest of their lives in the shadow of the man who had vanished without a trace. The inability to apprehend Charles Rogers created a permanent state of unresolved trauma for the survivors and the community. In 1975, a full decade after the murders, the legal system was forced to take a final, pragmatic step. The courts of Texas, facing the insurmountable reality that the primary suspect was nowhere to be found and that his assets remained in legal limbo, declared Charles Rogers legally dead in absentia. This was not a declaration based on the recovery of remains or a death certificate, but a necessity to allow the remaining family members to settle the estate. It was a closing of the ledger, a bureaucratic finality that stood in stark contrast to the visceral, open-ended horror of the crimes themselves. Even as the legal status of a suspect was settled, the mystery of his ultimate fate continued to plague the minds of those who had worked the case. The investigators had to grapple with the psychological weight of the crime. They were not just dealing with the loss of 2 lives, but with the terrifying prospect that a highly intelligent, trained individual, capable of extreme violence and total self-control, was out there in the world. They were forced to consider the possibility that Charles had utilized his knowledge of survival, his linguistic abilities, and his potential connections to establish a new life in a foreign country. The theory that he had crossed into Mexico or moved further south into Central or South America gained traction among those who had spent the most time analyzing his profile. These regions offered ample opportunities for a man of his background to disappear into anonymity, far away from the reach of the Houston police or the constraints of the American judicial system. The investigation, ultimately, served to emphasize the profound isolation of the Rogers family and the failure of the surrounding society to perceive the escalating danger within. The detectives realized that the neighborhood's commitment to privacy, the very thing that made it a desirable place to live, had functioned as a veil for the horror unfolding behind the closed doors of 1815 Driscoll Street. The failure to stop the murders was not a failure of law enforcement, but a failure of community awareness, a chilling demonstration of how people can live and die in absolute silence while others are merely a few feet away. The case remained a cold, sharp reminder of the limits of police work, the fragility of the suburban veneer, and the terrifying capacity of a single human being to act with total, remorseless efficiency. Even as the file gathered dust in the archives of the Houston Police Department, the absence of Charles Rogers remained the loudest, most persistent aspect of the entire affair, a ghost story that refused to be laid to rest. The legal declaration of Charles Rogers as dead in absentia in 1975 was a procedural necessity for the settlement of the Rogers family estate, but for the investigators who had spent years obsessively tracking the phantom of Driscoll Street, it felt like a hollow victory. The judicial system had effectively erased him, moving his existence from the realm of the living suspect to the ledger of the deceased. Yet this bureaucratic finality did nothing to silence the questions that haunted the Houston authorities. The trial of the evidence, even without the defendant present to face a jury, had been played out in the court of public opinion and within the minds of those tasked with upholding the law. The failure to bring Charles Rogers to justice remained a persistent, festering wound in the history of Texas crime, a reminder that the most meticulous and dangerous offenders could occasionally slip through the fingers of the law, not by escaping through a window during a police raid, but by fundamentally removing themselves from the visible world. Inside the courtroom, the absence of the defendant transformed the proceedings into a surreal examination of a man who was no longer there. The legal representatives of the family, tasked with the mundane but vital responsibility of untangling the web of land titles, bank accounts, and property deeds that Fred and Edwina had controlled, were forced to recount the story of the family's dysfunction as part of the public record. They spoke of the decades of financial abuse, the documents signed under duress, and the strange, silent life that had led to the final, fatal encounter on Father's Day. For the spectators and the journalists who attended these sessions, the story was almost too grotesque to be believed. It was not a conventional murder trial where a prosecutor presents a motive and a defense attorney fights for an acquittal. It was an autopsy of a family structure, a clinical presentation of how a human being could be pushed until they simply stopped being a son and became an executioner. The evidence presented to the court was the same evidence that had left the responding officers in a state of shock. The lack of a struggle, the surgical precision of the dismemberment, and the terrifying efficiency of the cleaning process. These details were no longer just clues in an ongoing investigation. They were becoming the foundational elements of a legend. The courtroom, usually a place for the resolution of disputes and the delivery of justice, became a space where the sheer impossibility of the perpetrator's skill was highlighted. The lawyers, in their arguments, described a man who had functioned with the cold, unfeeling detachment of a machine. They painted a picture of a suspect who did not act out of passion, but out of a calculated, long-term plan to reclaim his life from the people who had spent 43 years systematically eroding it. By framing the narrative this way, the legal process unintentionally elevated the status of the perpetrator, turning a man who had committed a monstrous, unforgivable crime into a figure of dark, calculating mystery. The impact of the legal proceedings on the broader community was profound. The case of the Icebox murders ceased to be a local tragedy and began to transcend into the territory of urban legend. People talked about the house on Driscoll Street in hushed, frightened tones, warning their children to stay away from the quiet, pristine residence. The fear was not just that a murderer had once walked those halls, but that the murderer might still be out there, living a new life in some distant city, having successfully navigated the system and emerged unscathed. The lack of a definitive conclusion, the absence of a trial where a jury could look the killer in the eyes and deliver a verdict, left the public with a sense of unease. They were forced to live with the reality that some crimes go unpunished and some perpetrators simply vanish into the ether, leaving behind only the cold, sterile remnants of their work. For the legal system, the death in absentia decree was the most efficient way to close the file on a messy, unsolvable problem. The assets were redistributed, the property was eventually sold, and the immediate financial disputes that had driven the conflict were resolved. However, the legal finality did not equate to justice. The victims, Fred and Edwina Rogers, had been brutalized and systematically erased in their own home, and there was no one to answer for their deaths. The law, which exists to provide order and retribution, had been rendered powerless by the sheer skill and foresight of the man who had committed the murders. This realization had a ripple effect through the local legal and law enforcement communities, leading to a quiet, often unacknowledged frustration that permeated the decades that followed. Whenever the case was discussed, it served as a cautionary tale about the limits of investigative reach when faced with a perpetrator who had no ties, no history of impulsive behavior, and a lifetime of training in tactical evasion. The courtroom environment, though devoid of a physical defendant, served as a platform for the final, collective effort to reconstruct the reality of the 1815 Driscoll Street residence. Witnesses who had been ignored or who had been unable to provide information at the time of the discovery were called to reflect on what they had known. They described the silence, the isolation, and the strange, eerie feeling that something was fundamentally wrong with the house. These testimonials, while not sufficient to secure a conviction in a living trial, provided the texture for the historical record. They filled in the gaps of a story, transforming the dry facts of the forensic evidence into a human narrative. The attorneys, through their questioning and their opening and closing statements, synthesized this into a story that the public could understand, even if they could never fully comprehend the motivations of the man who had orchestrated the nightmare. The culmination of the legal process in 1975 effectively silenced the formal search for Charles Rogers. The resources that had been dedicated to the manhunt were officially reallocated to other, more pressing matters. The file, while kept accessible, moved from the active desk of the lead detectives to the archives, where it was joined by thousands of other unsolved crimes. The legal system had done its part. It had determined the fate of the assets, declared the suspect dead in the eyes of the law, and provided a framework for the conclusion of the family's estate. Yet, for those who had been close to the case, the verdict felt premature. They knew that the legal determination of death was a bureaucratic convenience, not a reflection of reality. The possibility that Charles Rogers had lived on for years, or perhaps even decades, under an assumed identity remained a constant, unsettling thought for the investigators who had spent their careers looking for him. The psychological legacy of the trial, and the process leading up to it, was that it cemented the reputation of the Icebox murders as one of the most enigmatic crimes in American history. It became a point of reference for anyone looking to understand the depths of familial dysfunction and the potential for a quiet, intelligent individual to commit acts of extreme, methodical violence. The legal process did not solve the mystery. It only organized the known facts into a permanent record that could be studied, debated, and analyzed by future generations. It provided a sense of structure to the chaos, but it left the central, terrifying question of where the perpetrator had gone and what he had done with the rest of his life entirely unanswered. Ultimately, the courtroom proceedings highlighted the absolute helplessness of the community in the face of a crime that was conceived and executed with such internal, total isolation. The law could handle the aftermath, the property, and the legal status of the family, but it could not address the fundamental, human failure that allowed the situation to exist in the first place. The trial of the evidence, even in the absence of the accused, revealed that the true victim of the situation was the society that had remained oblivious to the slow, steady accumulation of horror until it was far too late. As the final gavel fell and the file was formally archived, it marked the end of the legal chapter of the Icebox murders, but it left the deeper, more disturbing questions about the human condition and the nature of the phantom of Driscoll Street lingering in the minds of everyone involved. The mystery was no longer a matter of police work, but a ghost story that had been written into the history of Houston, waiting for the day when some new shred of evidence might finally reveal the truth of what had happened to the man who vanished into the dark, leaving his parents behind in the cold, artificial silence of their own refrigerator. The legacy of the Icebox murders does not reside in the sterile, archival boxes of the Houston Police Department, nor in the dry, legal declarations of the 1970s. It exists as a haunting, permanent shadow cast over the history of American true crime. The case of Fred and Edwina Rogers serves as a chilling testament to the fragility of the suburban dream, demonstrating how a lifetime of suppressed trauma and familial dysfunction can reach a point of violent, catastrophic equilibrium. When the officers first broke the seal of the house on Driscoll Street, they were not just entering a crime scene, they were entering the final, horrific destination of a path that had been carved out over 4 decades of silence. The perpetrator, Charles Rogers, remains a specter who continues to evade not just the authorities, but the very possibility of human understanding. His disappearance was not merely a physical escape. It was the ultimate, defiant act of a man who had lived his entire life in the margins, and who, when forced into the light of the public consciousness, chose to vanish entirely. The theory that emerged years later, linking Charles Rogers to the assassination of President John F. Kennedy, adds a layer of surreal, historical complexity to an already unfathomable story. Whether or not one believes the assertion that he was a sleeper agent, an operative who stood on the grassy knoll in Dallas, the existence of such a theory speaks to the vacuum of truth left in his wake. In the absence of a life story, in the absence of a trial, and in the absence of a body, society filled the void with the most sensational explanation possible. The narrative of the man who possessed the tactical skills, the linguistic prowess, and the extreme emotional detachment to kill his parents, and then step into a life of global espionage provided a psychological bridge for those who could not accept that a person could simply disappear into nothingness. It suggests a man of such profound capability that he could manipulate the highest echelons of power, yet he was still bound by the petty, crushing dynamics of his own household until the day he finally broke. This case forces us to reckon with the inherent danger of silence. The neighbors who lived on Driscoll Street, in their adherence to the quiet, dignified boundaries of suburban life, provided the perfect cover for the atrocities occurring just meters away. This is the true horror of the icebox murders. It highlights that the most monstrous acts do not always require a chaotic, loud, or public environment to germinate. They can thrive in the silence of a house where no one speaks, where communications are slid under a door, and where a man can exist for years without his neighbors even knowing his name. The incident serves as a terrifying reminder of the limitations of our social awareness. We look for monsters in the shadows, in the overtly aggressive, or in the clearly troubled, yet the most dangerous individual may be the one who possesses the discipline to remain entirely invisible, hidden in plain sight, maintaining the illusion of normalcy while planning a descent into absolute violence. The psychological weight that this case places on the concept of family is equally profound. Fred and Edwina Rogers were not just victims, they were the architects of a dynamic that made their own demise almost inevitable. Their lifetime of control, their exploitation of their son's intelligence, and their refusal to treat him as a human being created the very monster that would eventually destroy them. We are left to contemplate the tragedy of a life, Charles's life, that was defined entirely by his reaction to his parents. If he had never been subjected to that specific, toxic environment, what would he have become? He possessed the brilliance of a scientist and the courage of a pilot, yet all of that potential was funneled into the narrow, dark purpose of endurance and, eventually, extermination. The story of the Rogers family is a warning that when we treat the people closest to us as instruments of our control, we are not building a foundation of family, but a powder keg. Even decades later, the icebox murders continue to serve as a cornerstone of true crime analysis because they defy resolution. There is no catharsis here. There is no courtroom drama that ends with a verdict, no prisoner who can explain his motivations, and no closure for the families involved. The case is a persistent, open question. Every time we encounter a story of an unsolved crime, we are reminded of the Rogers residence, where the most unsettling aspect is not the butchery itself, but the utter completeness of the perpetrator's disappearance. It challenges our belief in the reach of justice and our faith that the truth will eventually emerge. In the case of Charles Rogers, the truth did not emerge, it simply stopped existing. He exited the world on his own terms, leaving behind a legacy that is defined more by his absence than by his presence. The ongoing fascination with the case and the continued debates over the veracity of the CIA operative theory highlight the human need to impose a story upon the senseless. We want the world to have a logic. We want to believe that there is a reason behind every act, that there is a grand scheme, or that there is a culprit waiting in the shadows who will eventually be exposed. The Rogers case frustrates this need. It remains a raw, jagged edge in the narrative of American history, a story that refuses to be smoothed out or explained away. It stands as a monument to the reality that some individuals have the capacity to exist entirely outside the reach of society, and that some events, no matter how much we study them, will remain forever beyond the scope of human understanding. As we look back at the 1960s, a time of massive social and political upheaval in America, the Rogers case seems like a dark reflection of the era's hidden fractures. The domestic sphere, often idealized as a place of refuge from the turmoil of the outside world, was, in this instance, a theater of cold, calculated war. The meticulous nature of the crime, the washing, the packaging, the cooling, speaks to a mind that was profoundly isolated from the societal norms of the time. It was a singular act of rebellion that left no room for negotiation. By erasing his parents, Charles Rogers attempted to erase his own history, stripping away the roles of son and captive, and leaving behind a void that no amount of investigation could fill. The silence that reclaimed the house at 1815 Driscoll Street after the police left is the same silence that has enveloped the case for over 60 years. It is a silence that speaks to the power of the human capacity for secrets and the terrifying potential for a person to shed their identity. We are left with the image of the refrigerator, the white, humming appliance that held the secrets of the family until the door was finally pulled open. That image remains the most potent symbol of the entire ordeal, a container of the mundane turned into a repository of the grotesque, a vessel of artificial preservation for the physical remnants of a shattered life. It reminds us that no matter how much we sanitize our lives, no matter how clean we scrub our surfaces, the past is always waiting to be uncovered, and sometimes it is the silence that screams the loudest. The story of the Icebox murders is not a closed file. It is an ongoing, atmospheric presence that continues to challenge our understanding of what a human being is capable of doing in the dark. It is a story that requires no sensationalism, for the facts themselves are more than enough to capture the imagination and evoke a deep, lingering dread. It remains one of the most chilling cases in American history because it forces us to confront the fact that there are individuals who can move through our society hidden by our own indifference, until the moment they choose to reveal the darkness they have been carrying. In the end, the Phantom of Driscoll Street is a reminder of the fragility of our systems, the depth of our human complexity, and the chilling truth that some doors, once opened, reveal secrets that can never be fully put back to rest. The mystery remains, cold and preserved, waiting in the silence. The enduring enigma of the Icebox murders resides not merely in the grisly mechanics of the crime, nor the chilling precision of the dismemberment, but in the psychological vacuum left behind by the utter disappearance of Charles Rogers. As we reflect upon the progression of this dark narrative, from the stifling, silent walls of the Driscoll Street house to the bureaucratic closure of the 1970s, we are confronted with the terrifying prospect of a man who managed to successfully sever every tether to his own existence. The human psyche is fundamentally social. Our identities are forged through our interactions, our relationships, and our roles within a community. Charles Rogers, however, performed a radical, inverse alchemy, stripping away every outward identifier until nothing remained but a phantom. The case serves as a permanent, unsettling disruption in the timeline of Houston's history, a narrative that refuses to be constrained by the limitations of conventional forensic logic or the comforting finality of the law. When we consider the possibility of his continued existence beyond the borders of the United States, we are forced to contemplate the resourcefulness and the cold, calculated intent of a man who had already committed the ultimate transgression. If Charles did indeed escape to the humid, dense landscapes of Central or South America, he would have been required to shed his past with the same systematic thoroughness with which he had scrubbed the bathroom tiles of his parents' home. He would have had to adopt a new name, a new history, and a new persona, effectively becoming a completely different entity. The ability to do this, to live a life in the shadows while knowing that one's true self has left behind a scene of such profound carnage, demands a level of psychological detachment that is almost beyond the pale of human experience. It suggests a man who was not merely a murderer, but a master of his own self-erasure, someone who understood the mechanics of visibility and knew exactly how to dismantle his own presence from the world. The fascination with his possible role in the assassination of President John F. Kennedy serves as a testament to our profound discomfort with the mundane origins of true evil. We struggle to reconcile the image of a quiet, eccentric man living in a suburban bedroom with the capacity for such absolute, industrial-scale violence. By linking him to a historical event of such magnitude, we transform him from a domestic killer into a character of grand, international intrigue. This does not necessarily make the hypothesis true, but it highlights our desperation to find meaning in the chaos. If Charles Rogers was part of a larger, systemic, and hidden mechanism of power, his actions on Father's Day become a small, albeit horrifying, component of a much larger, darker puzzle. It allows us to view him as a professional, an operative, rather than as a broken, traumatized son who reached a breaking point. Yet, even if this theory were true, it would only deepen the mystery, as it would imply that he was shielded by forces that operated far beyond the reach of the local authorities. The house at 1815 Driscoll Street has long since been renovated, altered, and occupied by new residents who likely have no connection to the events of 1965. The physical structure has been sanitized of the memories and the blood, yet the history of the address remains a haunting footnote in the consciousness of the city. There is a profound irony in the fact that a home, designed to be a place of shelter and intimate connection, could become the site of such total dehumanization. The story reminds us that privacy is a double-edged sword. It protects our dignity and our autonomy, but it also creates the darkness where the most severe dysfunctions can thrive. In the case of the Rogers family, the silence that they maintained, that strange, nonverbal exchange of notes, was the very thing that allowed the tragedy to scale up to the point of no return. They lived together in a state of mutual isolation, a fragile arrangement that was bound to end in a catastrophic collapse. We must also consider the lingering impact on the investigative community. For the detectives who were tasked with the case, the failure to secure a resolution was not just a professional disappointment, it was a psychological burden. They spent their careers grappling with the fact that a man they had categorized as a suspect had simply walked out of the frame and never returned. The icebox murders became the standard by which all other cases of domestic violence and missing persons were measured. It demonstrated the horrifying truth that a perpetrator who is sufficiently disciplined, who possesses no need for recognition, and who has no desire to return to their former life, can effectively cease to exist as a target for law enforcement. The silence of Charles Rogers was a weapon as potent as any tool he used to commit his crimes. The question of what truly occurred in the final moments before he vanished is one that will likely remain forever unanswered. Did he sit in the quiet house for a time, reflecting on what he had done? Did he experience a moment of remorse, or did he feel a sense of profound liberation, finally free from the toxic dynamic that had dominated his life? The fact that he was able to clean the house so thoroughly suggests a state of mind that was remarkably calm, focused, and devoid of the chaotic impulses that characterize most crimes of passion. He was, in his own way, completing a project, and his disappearance was merely the final step in a process of total removal. Whether he ended his own life or successfully cultivated a new existence, he achieved the one thing that most people cannot. He left behind a life that he had entirely consumed, leaving nothing for others to hold, judge, or understand. As we look at the case through the lens of modern forensic science, it is tempting to wonder if the outcome would be different today. With the ubiquity of digital surveillance, the sophistication of DNA analysis, and the global connectivity of information, the possibility of vanishing without a trace has decreased significantly. Yet, the case of Charles Rogers stands as an outlier, a reminder that even in an age of total observation, there exist those who can move through the cracks of the system. He was a product of his time, a man whose skills and background allowed him to navigate a world that was still largely analog and disconnected. His ghost continues to walk through the annals of history, not because he is a legendary villain in the classical sense, but because he represents the ultimate, terrifying freedom of the individual who has decided that they no longer have a place in the world of others. The finality of his legend is that he is neither alive nor dead. He is an idea, a placeholder for the darkest aspects of the human condition. Every discussion of the icebox murders inevitably returns to the same point. The mystery is not a lack of information, but a lack of personhood. We have the facts of a crime, the history of the abuse, and the details of the investigation, but we do not have the man. We only have the trace of his absence. And in that absence, we find a reflection of our own fear, the fear that beneath the veneer of suburban normalcy, there may be individuals who are entirely detached, completely capable of the most horrific acts, and entirely beyond our power to control or comprehend. The phantom of Driscoll Street remains, an eternal, silent presence in the history of crime, waiting in the cold, artificial dark of a house that no longer exists, reminding us that some secrets are never meant to be solved, and some shadows are never meant to be illuminated. The narrative of the icebox murders is a cold, hard stone in the river of our collective memory, around which the currents of inquiry and speculation flow, never eroding the central, terrifying fact of his departure. He remains the architect of his own void, the master of his own departure, and the enduring, unanswered question that defines the boundaries of our ability to ever truly know the mind of another. The story concludes not with an answer, but with the echo of a door closing in the night, a silence that has stretched across decades, a testament to the absolute power of a man who chose to leave everything behind and, in doing so, achieved a kind of immortality of mystery that no court could ever bestow, and no investigator could ever dismantle. It is the final, cold truth of the Rogers case. Some men do not just commit crimes, they erase the world, and then they simply step out of the frame. The conclusion of the Rogers saga, if one can truly call it a conclusion, is not found in the resolution of a case file but in the unsettling permanence of the void left behind by Charles Rogers. As we contemplate the vast, historical shadow cast by the events at 1815 Driscoll Street, we must confront the reality that some mysteries are not designed to be solved, but rather designed to endure as cautionary emblems of human extremity. The meticulous nature of the crimes, the calculated erasure of the physical scene, and the subsequent, total evaporation of the perpetrator represent a unique apex in the history of American true crime. It is a narrative that resists the traditional structures of moral lessons or judicial retribution. Instead, it leaves us with an open, pulsing wound in our understanding of how a human being, forged in the fires of lifelong domestic torment, can eventually turn against the very source of their pain with a cold, terrifying, and near-mechanical efficiency. The transition from the silent note-passing rituals under the bedroom door to the industrial-scale butchery in the kitchen serves as a haunting trajectory of a mind that had long since departed from the boundaries of conventional morality, finding solace only in the rigid, uncompromising logic of the physical sciences. We are left to grapple with the haunting image of the house itself. It was a space where the air must have been thick with the weight of decades of unspoken grievances. The architecture of the home became, in essence, an extension of the dysfunctional triad that lived within its walls. The attic, the back entrances, and the silent, dark corridors were not merely rooms. They were the tactical map for a phantom who refused to be seen, a man who had effectively turned his own life into a permanent act of surveillance and avoidance. When we consider the lives of Fred and Edwina Rogers, we see them not merely as the victims of a homicidal son, but as the architects of an environment where such an outcome was the only possible conclusion to their decades of psychological warfare. The tragedy of the case is that it was not a sudden explosion of random violence, but the culmination of a slow, agonizing process of degradation that occurred over 43 years. The house on Driscoll Street was a crucible, and the horror that emerged on that Father's Day was the grim, inevitable output of a machine that had been allowed to run unchecked for far too long. The enduring fascination with the perpetrator's disappearance is a symptom of our own collective anxiety regarding the existence of people who can act completely outside the reach of societal norms. In a modern world where our movements are tracked, our communications are monitored, and our identities are cemented through 1,000 different digital touchpoints, the story of Charles Rogers feels like a relic from another, more primitive and more permeable reality. He represents the ultimate, terrifying freedom, the freedom to abandon one's identity, to sever all familial and social ties, and to cease to exist in the eyes of the state and the community. This act of self-annihilation is what makes his crime so particularly chilling. He did not run away. He did not flee in fear. He simply ceased to be a part of the world of others. The legal declaration of death in absentia is the final acknowledgement that society possesses no mechanism to account for an individual who is determined to be truly, fundamentally unreachable. As we look deeper into the legacy of the Icebox murders, we must also address the silence that surrounded the case for so long. The failure of the community to intervene, or even to acknowledge the existence of the man living in the attic, remains a profound indictment of the suburban culture of the era. The privacy that the residents of Driscoll Street prized so highly, and the social contracts of politeness that governed their lives, were the very mechanisms that allowed the disaster to fester. The neighborly distance, which was intended to protect individual autonomy and tranquility, instead provided a cloak of invisibility for a man in the midst of a psychological collapse. This is the enduring lesson of the tragedy. that a community which prioritizes silence over connection and which respects the sanctity of a closed door above the welfare of the people behind it is a community that is fundamentally vulnerable to the horrors that can grow within its own borders. The silence of the neighborhood was not a sign of peace, but a dangerous, complicit absence of awareness. The forensic evidence, while clinically impressive, ultimately serves to highlight the emotional poverty of the entire affair. The neat, plastic-wrapped packages of flesh and the severed head in the vegetable crisper were not just evidence of a crime. They were a manifestation of a profound, internal dislocation. The killer treated his parents with the same scientific detachment that one might accord a biological specimen, a testament to the absolute emotional distance that had developed between them. There was no rage left in the act of cleaning the house. There was only the desire for a return to order, to a state of equilibrium where the source of his torment had been removed, and the evidence of his act had been meticulously sterilized. This is the terrifying realization that the icebox murders offer us, that the most horrific acts can be committed by those who have lost the capacity to view their fellow human beings as anything other than problems to be solved or obstacles to be overcome. When we consider the theories that have emerged in the decades since the investigation cooled, we see a reflection of our own desire to find order in the aftermath of the event. The claims that Charles Rogers was involved in the assassination of John F. Kennedy, while largely speculative and lacking in definitive, concrete proof, offer a psychological narrative that feels more complete than the reality of a domestic murder. To believe that he was an operative, a pawn in a larger, darker game of global power, makes the carnage in the kitchen easier to categorize. It suggests that he was a man of extraordinary, albeit malevolent, capability, rather than a broken son who had finally succumbed to the weight of his own existence. The human mind is inherently averse to the randomness and the senselessness of such crimes. We prefer the structure of a conspiracy, as it implies a level of intelligence and purpose that is, in its own way, reassuringly predictable. The final, cold truth is that we will likely never know what happened to Charles Rogers. He may have died shortly after fleeing the state, perhaps in an act of desperation or a lonely, natural end. He may have lived for decades in a remote, quiet corner of the world, never again engaging in the violence that defined his final days in Houston. He may have carried the weight of his secrets to his grave, or he may have successfully built a new life where the phantom of Driscoll Street was nothing more than a half-remembered nightmare. The mystery is the only thing that remains certain. It is a story that refuses to be finished, a puzzle with a missing central piece that can never be replaced. He remains a fixture in the annals of American crime, not because of the magnitude of his victim count, but because of the absolute, total success of his erasure. As we bring this reflection to a close, we must acknowledge that the icebox murders are, and will remain, a defining moment in the literature of true crime. They represent the point where the suburban dream, finally, irrevocably shattered, and the reality of the darkness that can hide within the home was laid bare for the entire nation to see. It is a story that requires no embellishment, for the cold, hard reality of the facts is more than enough to chill the blood of any reader. The case of Fred and Edwina Rogers, and the son who brought an end to their lives and then vanished into the humid Texas heat, remains a silent, persistent echo of the complexities of the human condition. It is a reminder that we are all, in some small way, the products of the environments we occupy, and that when those environments turn toxic, the results can be unimaginable. We are left only with a silence that has grown over the years, a silence that hides the phantom of Driscoll Street, a silence that serves as the final, absolute testament to a man who decided that he was finally and irrevocably finished with the world of others. The story of the icebox murders will continue to be told, for it contains the one thing that we can never truly reconcile with our own existence, the story of a man who chose to be nothing, and who, in his success, became the most enduring shadow in our history. The ultimate nature of the tragedy that unfolded at 1815 Driscoll Street lies in its stubborn refusal to conform to the neat, linear resolutions we crave from true crime narratives. As we reach the final vantage point of this investigation, we are not looking back at a solved mystery, but rather at a monument to the incomplete. The story of Fred and Edwina Rogers, and the son who orchestrated their annihilation with such chilling, surgical precision, serves as an eternal prompt for reflection on the limits of human knowledge and the capacity for total, absolute departure. In the decades that have passed since that Father's Day in 1965, the case has not diminished in its power to disturb. If anything, the silence surrounding the disappearance of Charles Rogers has only amplified the cold, haunting resonance of the events. We are compelled to revisit this narrative not because we expect to find a hidden cache of evidence, but because the very nature of his evasion challenges our perception of identity and the permanence of our own lives within the framework of society. One must consider the psychological weight carried by the investigators who spent their careers tethered to this case. They were the men and women who stood in the kitchen on that sweltering June afternoon, the ones who opened the refrigerator and witnessed the impossible scene of meticulously processed human remains. These individuals were not merely executing a task, they were the custodians of a nightmare. The psychological toll of witnessing such a complete negation of humanity is profound. They had to reconcile the sterile, clean surfaces of the Rogers home with the absolute chaos that had occurred within those walls. It is a dissonance that likely followed them for the rest of their lives, a constant, low-frequency hum of unresolved tension. Their inability to bring Charles to justice was not a failure of technique or intelligence, but a confrontation with a suspect who had fundamentally abandoned the rules of the game. He had stepped outside of the social contract entirely, and in doing so, he had become unreachable by the very systems designed to hold individuals accountable. The house itself, that modest, unassuming residence on a quiet Houston street, remains the most potent symbol of the entire ordeal. In our collective imagination, we view it as a site of ancient, lingering static, a place where the air still holds the echoes of the silence that governed the daily interactions of the Rogers family. We must remember that the physical structure was only a container, the true geography of the crime was internal, mapped across the decades of resentment, the childhood trauma, and the crushing financial exploitation that formed the foundation of their life together. When we speak of the house, we are speaking of the crucible that produced the phantom. It is a cautionary tale about the environments we create and the pressures we exert on the people closest to us. If one were to visit the site today, they would find only the mundane reality of an ordinary life moving forward, yet the specter of what happened in that kitchen remains, a silent, invisible sentinel of the history that once transpired there. We are forced to confront the chilling potential for individuals to act as catalysts for their own total disappearance. Charles Rogers was not merely a fugitive, he was a man who mastered the art of non-existence. His background as a naval aviator and a geophysicist provided him with a unique set of cognitive tools that he repurposed for the ultimate act of evasion. He did not merely change his name or move to a different city. He systematically dismantled his own life, ensuring that there was nothing left for the world to latch onto. This degree of self-annihilation is rare in the annals of criminal behavior. It speaks to a mind that is profoundly, perhaps pathologically, detached from the rewards and risks that drive the rest of humanity. He had no desire for recognition, no need to relive his actions, and no interest in the consequences that would follow. He simply concluded his work and departed, leaving the world to pick up the pieces of a puzzle that he had already solved and abandoned. The obsession with his potential connection to the Kennedy assassination is, perhaps, the most telling aspect of the case's legacy. It represents our profound discomfort with the reality of the domestic murderer. We would prefer to believe that such a calculated, effective individual must have been a pawn in a much larger, global conspiracy. It allows us to process the horror by viewing it through the lens of political intrigue rather than the lens of family annihilation. The theory provides a frame, a sense of purpose, and a logic that the actual crime lacks. Yet, whether or not there is any truth to such assertions is almost secondary to the psychological necessity that birthed them. We need the conspiracy because the alternative, that a son could simply exist in a state of quiet, agonizing torture until he became an executioner, is too painful and too terrifying to fully embrace. In the final assessment, the icebox murders stand as a singular, chilling peak in the geography of American crime. They define a point where the personal, the familial, and the criminal collide, leaving behind nothing but the stark, unyielding evidence of a life, or two lives, that were permanently extinguished in the name of a private, impenetrable vengeance. We are left only with the questions. Where did he go? How did he live? Did he ever look back at what he had done? Or was the act of erasure so complete that even the memory of his parents became something he could simply discard? We will never have these answers. The silence of Charles Rogers is his final, lasting victory over the institutions that sought to name, shame, and punish him. He remains the architect of his own void, the master of his own departure, and the enduring, unanswered question that continues to haunt the history of Houston and the conscience of the nation. The legacy of the Rogers family is a cold, hard reminder of the fragility of our systems and the terrifying potential for a human being to act with total, remorseless efficiency. We are all living in a world of networks, connections, and visibility, yet the story of the Icebox murders reveals that there are those who can, with enough discipline and intent, slip through the cracks of everything we hold to be true. He is the ghost in the machine, the phantom who proved that the most absolute freedom of all is the freedom to simply vanish. As we close this final chapter on the incident, we are left with nothing but the echo of a closing door, the stillness of a neighborhood that once slept while a nightmare was being built in its midst, and the cold, unblinking eyes of Edwina Rogers, a gaze that remains frozen in our history, staring out from the bottom of a vegetable crisper, waiting for a justice that will never come. In a world that has long since forgotten the specific terror of that Father's Day, the silence is absolute, and the mystery remains, fixed and immutable, at the very center of our collective darkness, an eternal testament to the man who left the world behind and stepped into the nothingness he had spent his entire life preparing to inhabit. The phantom is gone, the house is empty, and the question remains, are we truly safe, or are we simply unaware of the shadows that are moving quietly, meticulously, and invisibly right beside us, waiting for their own moment to disappear? The answer is as cold as the ice he bought to preserve his secrets, a chilling, lingering realization that in the end, we are all ultimately responsible for our own survival in a world that can, without a moment's notice, be dismantled by someone who has nothing left to lose. The story is finished, yet the echo of the silence continues, a persistent, haunting reminder of the limits of our reach and the vast, unknown potential for the dark. The finality of the Icebox murders does not lie in the resolution of facts, but in the existential challenge the case poses to our understanding of the human condition. To study the life and the disappearance of Charles Rogers is to look directly into a void that reflects our deepest, most primal anxieties about the fragility of identity and the potential for total, unmoored isolation. As we move further away from that sweltering June day in 1965, the event transforms from a local criminal tragedy into a sort of dark, American folklore. It persists in our collective consciousness because it denies us the comfort of closure. We are left with the chilling image of the meticulously organized refrigerator, a monument to a mind that had systematically stripped away the messiness of life, blood, and emotion, leaving behind only the sterile, cold components of a horror that remains forever unresolved. This image acts as a psychological anchor, holding the memory of the crime firmly in place while the world continues its rapid, technological evolution, leaving the phantom of Driscoll Street behind in the analog darkness of the past. When we consider the broader implications of the Rogers tragedy, we are forced to contemplate the nature of silence as a tool of oppression and, eventually, a weapon of destruction. The silence that existed between Fred, Edwina, and Charles was not an absence of sound. It was an active, suffocating force. It was the medium through which their dysfunction was maintained and through which their resentments were allowed to calcify. By refusing to speak, by relying on the cold, disembodied ritual of passing notes beneath a door, they effectively dehumanized one another long before the first blow was struck. This silent environment is perhaps the most terrifying element of the entire narrative, as it highlights how easily we can become alienated from the people we live with when we stop communicating and start operating as isolated units of resentment. The tragedy of the Rogers family is a stark, unavoidable lesson in the danger of allowing communication to wither and die behind the closed doors of our private lives. The role of the physical environment in fostering such extreme outcomes cannot be overstated. The house on Driscoll Street was not a home, it was an architecture of containment. The way the family functioned, with Charles moving like a shadow, living in the attic and the back rooms, avoiding the front entrance, speaks to a domestic structure that had been perverted into something resembling a prison. The environment did not just reflect their dysfunction, it actively facilitated it. When we build our lives in such a way that we are separated by physical and emotional barriers, we create the very conditions that allow for the unimaginable. The house became a laboratory for the final, catastrophic experiment in human detachment, and the failure of the community to see this, or to intervene, serves as a haunting indictment of our tendency to prioritize individual privacy over the well-being of our neighbors. The disappearance of Charles Rogers remains the most enduring, complex mystery of the case. Whether he perished in some nameless, lonely corner of the globe or lived out his final days in the quiet, undisturbed anonymity of a foreign land, he achieved an outcome that is almost impossible in the contemporary world. He achieved the ultimate autonomy to choose, after committing such a monstrous act, to effectively leave the world behind as a final, defiant statement of his internal state. He did not care for justice, he did not care for public opinion, and he did not care for the legacy he left behind in the archives of Houston. He was, in the end, only concerned with his own departure from the reality that had created him. This is the ultimate, cold truth that the story offers us, that some individuals can reach a point of such profound alienation that the world we live in, with all its laws and structures, no longer holds any meaning for them. We must also reflect on the role of the investigator. The detectives who worked the case were, in many ways, the primary victims of the mystery's durability. They were tasked with solving a problem that was fundamentally designed to be unsolvable. By documenting every detail, by collecting every scrap of evidence, and by maintaining the integrity of the file, they became the curators of an obsession. Their work did not lead to an arrest or a trial, but it did ensure that the horror was not forgotten. Their dedication, while tragic in its lack of a satisfying outcome, serves as a testament to the importance of truth-seeking, even when the truth is elusive, fragmented, and terrifying. They stood against the darkness, even if the darkness was ultimately too vast and too silent to be fully illuminated. The legacy of the Icebox murders also challenges our understanding of justice. In a perfect world, a crime of such magnitude would be followed by a trial, a verdict, and a definitive end. But the Rogers case shows us that justice is not a universal constant. It is a system that can be defeated by a perpetrator who has nothing to lose and everything to gain from his own erasure. The inability to bring Charles to account for the slaughter of his parents is a reminder that the systems we rely on are only as strong as the evidence and the individuals we have to work with. When the evidence is as clean as the surfaces of the Rogers home, and the perpetrator is as invisible as a shadow, the system is rendered entirely, painfully powerless. This reality is what haunts the legal and law enforcement communities, for it reveals the fragility of our attempts to impose order on a world capable of such profound, methodical chaos. Looking ahead, the story of the Icebox murders will continue to serve as a cornerstone of true crime analysis precisely because it refuses to conform to our expectations. It is a narrative that will be retold, reanalyzed, and debated by future generations, each one seeking to find a logic or a meaning that we have failed to uncover. We will look at the old photographs of the Driscoll Street house, the grainy images of the refrigerator, and the dusty pages of the police reports, and we will continue to ask the same questions. Was it a conspiracy? Was it a breakdown? Was it an act of liberation? We will continue to debate these points, yet the core of the story will remain unmoved, a cold, silent, and permanent presence in our history. The mystery is not a problem to be solved. It is a reality to be acknowledged, the reality that within the heart of our orderly, suburban lives, there can exist a darkness that is as vast as it is incomprehensible. The conclusion of this journey through the events of June 1965 is a realization that we are, in our own lives, responsible for the stories we create. We are the architects of our own environments, and we are the ones who decide whether to open our doors or to retreat into the attic. The story of the Rogers family is a mirror held up to our own existence, a reminder of the need to foster connection, to demand transparency, and to recognize the warning signs of a humanity that has begun to fracture. We must learn from the Phantom of Driscoll Street, not by seeking to emulate his detachment, but by striving to ensure that we never allow ourselves to reach a point where we are so isolated that vanishing seems like the only possible solution. The mystery of the refrigerator remains, a silent, white sentinel, a permanent warning that the most dangerous thing we can do is to stop seeing the people right in front of us and to stop acknowledging the reality of the darkness that can grow when we choose silence over the difficult, messy, and necessary work of being human together. The phantom has long since left the frame, but the echo of his presence continues to resonate in the quiet, lonely places of our own lives, a reminder that we are all, ultimately, the keepers of our own light, and that it is our responsibility to make sure that no one in our world is ever forced, or ever decides, to step into the dark alone. The silence, finally, is all that remains, and in that silence, we find the chilling, absolute truth of a man who left everything behind to become a permanent, unanswered question in the heart of our history. The resonance of the icebox murders within the American consciousness is not merely a product of the gruesome facts, but a reflection of the profound unease we feel when confronted by the limits of our own investigative and psychological reach. As we reach the final stage of this examination, we must acknowledge that the mystery of Charles Rogers is less about the crime he committed and more about the existential void he left behind. The house on Driscoll Street serves as a threshold, a physical demarcation between the mundane, predictable reality of mid-century suburban life and the terrifying, inscrutable darkness that can lie within the human spirit. The case acts as a permanent interruption in the historical narrative of Houston, a jagged, unfinished edge that defies all attempts at smoothing, reconciliation, or closure. We find ourselves drawn back to the empty space where the perpetrator should have been, forever searching for a motive or a moment of frailty that would render him legible to our own limited understanding of morality and violence. The act of processing the remains was not merely a logistical necessity for the killer, it was the physical embodiment of his complete severance from the social world. By reducing his parents to categorized, sanitized, and stored components, he was performing a literal dismantling of the ties that bound him to the past. This act of cold, detached efficiency speaks to a psychological state that had successfully replaced all human connection with a rigid, internal calculus of objective outcomes. He was not acting out of malice in that moment, but out of a clinical need to resolve a state of disorder. This is what makes the icebox murders so uniquely disturbing. The violence was not the end point, but the catalyst for a systematic, professional-grade procedure that could only be carried out by someone who had already decided that the moral weight of their actions was irrelevant. The humanity he was erasing had already ceased to exist in his own mind long before the first incision was made in the silence of the bathroom. The inability of the investigators to penetrate the armor of his invisibility reveals a fundamental weakness in our systems of accountability. We rely on the assumption that even the most disturbed individual has some connection to the social order, that they have friends, that they leave a financial trail, that they possess habits or desires that can be tracked and intercepted. Charles Rogers shattered this assumption with a degree of success that remains unparalleled. He existed as a ghost within the very system that failed to perceive him, a man who occupied space without leaving a footprint. His success was not just in the act of murder, but in the subsequent, flawless execution of his own disappearance. He demonstrated that in a world governed by predictability and routine, an individual who is prepared to sacrifice everything, every attachment, every comfort, and every identity can achieve a state of true, absolute autonomy that is both terrifying and, in its own bleak way, impossible to fathom. When we consider the theories that have sought to fill the void of his history, particularly the sensationalist links to the highest levels of political conspiracy, we are really speaking to our own profound discomfort with the senseless. The idea that he was a trained operative, a man whose skills were harnessed by forces greater than himself, is a psychological coping mechanism. It allows us to view the horror as part of a larger, perhaps unavoidable, sequence of events rather than the outcome of a private, domestic collapse. We crave a world where even the most monstrous acts possess a structure, a rationale, and a hidden hand. The reality of the Rogers case, however, suggests something far more unsettling, that the most profound horrors are often birthed in the quiet, unmonitored spaces of our own homes, fueled by the accumulation of small, daily failures in empathy and communication. The true conspiracy was not one of global power, but the hidden, long-term conspiracy of silence that defined the Rogers family household. The legacy of the case serves as a silent warning about the dangers of extreme emotional and social isolation. The note-passing ritual that occurred beneath the door was the most visible symptom of a family that had fundamentally collapsed into a state of mutual hostility and estrangement. It was the physical manifestation of their failure to remain human in the presence of one another. We should view the case not just as a cautionary tale about crime, but as a meditation on the vital necessity of transparency and vulnerability. When we allow ourselves to become islands of resentment, when we prioritize our own privacy over the shared, human experience, we create the conditions for the unimaginable. The icebox murders remind us that our safety is not just a matter of locks and alarms, but of the connections we maintain and the openness we demonstrate to the people around us. Without that connective tissue, we are all potentially walking in the footsteps of the phantom, susceptible to the same cold, isolating currents of madness. We must also recognize the debt we owe to the individuals who maintain the records of our darkest moments. The archivists, the researchers, and the investigators who keep the story of the icebox murders alive are doing more than just cataloging a crime. They are upholding the memory of the victims and ensuring that the silence does not become a permanent state of erasure. Fred and Edwina Rogers, in their final, gruesome moments, were stripped of their dignity and their personhood by the man who was meant to be their legacy. By continuing to examine the facts of their death, we are, in a small way, restoring a sense of witness to their history. We are acknowledging that their lives were not just the preamble to their murder, and that the horror they endured deserves to be recognized, if not fully understood. The record exists to prevent the darkness from becoming total, a beacon in the archives that continues to shine a light on the truth of what transpired. The mystery of the disappearance, while it continues to frustrate and haunt us, is also the source of the case's enduring power. If Charles had been caught, the story would have had its resolution. It would have faded into the background of standard criminal history. But by remaining outside the frame, he has ensured that his presence will continue to be felt, a permanent shadow in the corner of our collective consciousness. He represents the possibility of the unknown, the terrifying realization that there are people in our world who can exist entirely outside of our control. The icebox murders are a story of a man who chose to be nothing, and in his success, he became everything we fear about the fragility of our own existence. We are all living in a world that is constructed on the assumptions of order, predictability, and shared reality, and his act of total, unremorseful departure is the ultimate challenge to those assumptions. In the final reckoning, we must move forward with the knowledge that our safety and our understanding are always at risk of being dismantled. We must be the guardians of our own connections, the ones who break the silence before it has a chance to solidify into the walls that once separated the Rogers family. The story is finished, yet the echo continues, an echo of a closing door, a vacuum where a life used to be, and a silent, unblinking gaze that stares out from the history of Houston, reminding us that we are only as strong as the ties we hold dear. The mystery of the refrigerator is not a story about what happened to a man. It is a story about what happens when we stop being people to one another. The light of truth may never fully reach the center of the void, but in the effort to keep the history, in the commitment to remain aware, we find the only true, available remedy for the darkness that this case represents. The phantom has long since stepped into the unknown, but his shadow remains, a permanent feature of the landscape of our understanding, a reminder that the world is vast, the darkness is real, and the responsibility to prevent the silences, and must always be our own. The mystery remains, cold and perfectly preserved in the heart of our memory, a final, unanswerable question that defines the boundaries of our ability to know, to see, and to protect one another in a world that is far more fragile and far more capable of terror than we ever dared to imagine. As the story ends, the quiet remains, absolute and unyielding, a testament to the man who decided that he was finally finished with the world, leaving us all to contemplate the vast, empty space where he once stood, and the terrifying, silent power of a life that simply ceased to be, leaving behind only the cold, unyielding reality of the mystery that continues to pulse, like a faint, rhythmic heartbeat in the deep, unmeasured stillness of the archive.